For more than 100 years, they were Americans in name only. During that time, Mexican Americans were denied the rights of other citizens, and many were stripped of their land.
I am angry, and my people is angry because the Anglo is using the money, the power, his language, his culture.
In the 1960s, a new generation of leaders came forward and fought for change.
We came here to build the new Chicano movement. That's what we came here for.
They call themselves Chicanos, an ancient Mexican word that describes poorest of the poor. But they wore the name with pride.
Come on up, brothers, we are waiting for you.
They walked out of fields and demanded a fair wage. They walked out of schools and demanded better education.
57% of the students at Garfield drop out year after year. There has to be a problem. We're not operating in a vacuum. There's social injustice.
They formed a political party and demanded full citizenship.
It's being classified as militant, but I don't consider this to be militant. If trying to look for justice and democracy in our country is considered to be militant, then I'm all for being militant.
The American dream was all around them, but for years they had been excluded from its promise. This is the story of how Mexican Americans claimed that dream as their own. October 1966, a group of Mexican Americans gathered to remind the United States of a long-forgotten promise. Calling themselves the Alianza, the Alliance, they met and claimed this federal land as their own, guaranteed by a treaty signed between the United States and Mexico. They arrested 2 United States forest rangers for trespassing.
We're taking full responsibility. The town of San Joaquin, just a second, yes, I know your laws already. We've been citizens of the United States for 120 years and we know the law. We're taking this upon our shoulders in the name of the town of San Joaquin del Rio de Chama.
Ultimately, it was the leader of the Alianza who was arrested, Reyes Lopez Tijerina. But he planned to use that trial to argue that, according to a treaty signed by the United States, the people of northern New Mexico legitimately owned the land. At one time, the land in New Mexico, along with California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, Texas, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, belonged to Mexico. In 1846, the United States declared war on Mexico. 2 years later, the war was over, and Mexico had lost half its territory. Overnight, 100,000 Mexicans became foreigners on soil that had belonged to their families for generations. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo promised these new Americans free enjoyment of their liberty and property of every kind.
The land was sacred because your parents and grandparents were buried there. Some of your children were buried there. And you would be buried there. So the sweat, blood, and tears of generations have filtered into the land. So it is holy, it is sacred, sacrosanct.
But the original land grants had been given under Spanish and Mexican law, which U.S. courts often did not recognize. Over the years, Mexican Americans lost their land to speculators, lawyers, and cattle barons. Some property was taken by force.
And the heirs to those land grants have resented that ever since. The Tierra Amarilla land grant was an immense land grant given to a certain Martinez from Los Ojos, New Mexico. And I understand that the land grant was sold for $200, a team of horses, and I don't know how many pounds of flour or something like that. But only one of the heirs signed the deed. The other heirs didn't. So the land grant was taken illegally.
By 1960, millions of acres, including the Tierra Amarilla grant, had been taken from the original landowning families. Stepping into this long-simmering land dispute was Reyes Lopez Tijerina. Born in Texas during the 1920s, he was the son of migrant workers. After a prophetic dream about injustice in New Mexico, Tijerina decided to learn treaty law. He was convinced that he could reclaim the Tierra Amarilla grant.
Although we are fighting for land, we are fighting for the survival and protection of our culture. To the extent that we feel that to rape the culture and the
Some who disagreed with Tijerina thought he was an opportunist, looking for personal power.
That's just the way we will fight.
What you're really saying, in effect, is that you own this land, you want everybody else to get off of it, or if they want to stay on it, to submit to your regulation.
No, to the regulations of the town councils, which are covered and protected by the Constitution of New Mexico, Article 2, Section 5, and by the Constitution of the United States, Article 12, Section 2, where it states that all the treaties made by the United States government are the supreme law of the land.
The people of northern New Mexico lived as tenants on land that once was theirs. In 1965, the Forest Service revoked half the grazing permits for small farmers, pushing them to the point of desperation. There was need for someone who could express their frustrations. When Tijerina, a former fundamentalist preacher, came along, he sounded like the Messiah himself.
We are now waiting an answer from the State Department to claim what belongs to us.
He was speaking the magic words. The issue, the struggle, had been alive for all these generations. And here was a man on a white horse, a man with tremendous charisma, who plugged in to a deep felt passion, more than a feeling, a passion. And he turned the spirits on.
Tijerina's mission brought him face to face with northern New Mexico's district attorney, Alfonso Sanchez.
At that point is where he started saying that the object of his corporation was to take over properties that the Alianza claims belongs to them by force if necessary, blah, blah, blah. And I looked at him straight in the eye and I said, Reyes, if you intend to do what you tell me that this corporation is going to do, it is illegal. And right now I'm telling you that if you do what you say you're going to do, I'm the one that's going to stop you.
Que la prisión trajo cambio y trajo
In the spring of 1967, Tijerina faced federal charges for his role in the occupation of Carson National Forest. Tensions in northern New Mexico were escalating. Forest Service fences were cut. Haystacks and barns were torched. The Alianza was blamed.
I think that the action of Tijerina is matched by an equally violent reaction. For instance, I've had several ranchers come into my office and swear that they're going to kill someone.
When Tijerina announced plans for a meeting to plot the Alianza's next move, Sanchez was convinced the group was preparing a showdown to reclaim the land. The district attorney decided to stop the meeting.
I explained, if you meet and your object is to plan how you're going to take over property that doesn't belong to you, the Alianza or Tijerina or anybody other than the rightful owners, then it is an unlawful assembly, and I will prosecute you and file criminal charges against each one of you if later on it turns out that that's what you're going to do.
So with excuses that we were communists and trying to take over the land, he confiscated files and blocked the roads and threatened the people. Anybody going to that convention would be arrested.
This was getting out of hand. What if Tijerina were just a little bit successful? There were land grants all over New Mexico. And I think it was a real economic threat.
Sanchez called for the arrest of Alianza leaders, but Tijerina got away. Those who were arrested would face charges at a hearing to be held the following Monday, June 5th, at Tierra Amarilla. It would be a day long remembered by New Mexicans.
We don't believe in violence, but we believe in Jesus Christ, who used a whip to drive out the false preachers out of the temple. And I think that's all we did in the courthouse of Tierra Amarilla. We just used a little whip.
Tijerina and a group of armed men stormed the courthouse. They were there, they said, to make a citizen's arrest of District Attorney Sanchez for violating their right to assembly. When gunfire began, Sheriff Benny Naranjo was inside the courthouse.
My jailer ran into the hallway and he says, "Get the hell out of here, Benny. Get out of here." And he jumped out the window. Then they shot him outside the window. And I went to the window and they started shooting at me, and then they started shooting at me through the door off the hallway, so I laid down on the floor. But I heard them, that they kept saying, "Reyes said not to hurt nobody, that all we want is Alfonso Sanchez."
Sanchez was nowhere to be found.
Had I been there, I guess those 100 bullet holes I wouldn't be here.
A state patrolman and the jailer were shot and seriously wounded. Two others, a reporter and a deputy sheriff, were held captive all afternoon.
My understanding is that Reyes had tried to kind of calm down what turned to be an assault, and he wasn't able to. Because what he did, he just offered a vision to some people who were ready to fight.
The governor's office called in the National Guard. Revolution, it seemed, had come to northern New Mexico.
It was like Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa were alive again. And they had gone and had claimed their land again. It was like wildfire in the movement when we heard about it. We heard it like that.
Among land grant people, there was kind of a victorious sense that finally, you know, our cause is out in the open, and finally, maybe we can galvanize the nation, such as the African American movement has done.
Some Mexican Americans were alarmed by the violence that had taken place. But Tijerina's actions fired the imagination of movement activists and inspired a corrido, a traditional ballad commemorating the event.
It was at the county courthouse, hamlet of Tierra Amarilla, June 5th, 1967, the county of Rio Arriba, a number of our race.
After 10 days on the run, Tijerina turned himself in. He now faced state criminal charges.
Out of this whole movement was emerging the feeling we had, this used to be Mexico, this used to be our land, but it was a growing sense of a people and a collective history of struggle against an invasion and occupation and takeover and everything like that. And I think that had a lot to do with it.
The struggle for land inspired urban Chicanos who believed the United States conquest of the Southwest had turned them into second-class citizens.
Certain things you knew, stores you shouldn't shop in, movie theaters you probably best not go to, and still the synonymous sense that the word Mexican went with the word dirty. I remember as a child people feeling that the best thing they could say to me was, well, you're a Spanish girl, aren't you? And I'd say, no, I'm Mexican.
I hated being Mexican. There was no respect, there was no status, there was no participation in the society. My father not speaking good English was an embarrassment when I would go to school as a child. Now, these were things that I wasn't able to intellectualize. These were things that I felt. We were walking around with a tremendous burden of being Mexican in a country that didn't want us except as labor.
This is something that I'll never forget. And I'll never forget it because this was the evening that I asked my wife to marry me.
Edward Roybal, one of the first Mexican Americans elected to Congress, experienced discrimination firsthand.
And the policeman lined us all up, about 14 couples, made us put our hands up over our heads, and they went through our pockets. Then they asked each one of us to show credentials. I gave them my wallet, and after they looked at it, this policeman started to take my cards out of my wallet and drop them to the sidewalk. And then after he did that, he said, now you pick them up. I remember getting on my knees and picking them up. This is something, of course, that a man that had just asked his best girl to marry him will not forget.
Our parents consciously chose not to share their experiences with us, their bitter, discriminatory experiences. They thought that it would embitter us, that it would create sort of a hatred within us that they wanted to prevent and protect us from.
Many of the issues of civil rights are very complex and most difficult.
President Lyndon Johnson, a Texan elected with broad Mexican-American support in 1964, was already under pressure from the Mexican-American community. The courthouse raid dramatized the growing unrest among Mexican Americans. The legacy of poverty and discrimination was abundantly clear. Half of all Mexican Americans had less than 8 years of education, and a third lived in poverty. Politically, they were underrepresented. In 1967, only 4 Mexican Americans served in Congress.
Spanish-speaking people
I think, need to get closer to their government and to get action from their government. And get action
Johnson responded by creating a cabinet committee on Mexican-American affairs.
For help in solving their very special, unique problems. I named Vicente Jimenez to the chairmanship of the committee.
And that message came to me too, that, hey, you've got to do something, because here's this young radical group out there, they've got something on their minds, and I happen to believe that they're right. Establishment, you got to do something.
And say to them, look, when you come to that particular area, you must remember that here is a...
We walked this path to get to where we want to go. Some of the others wanted to walk another path to get to where they wanted to go. But where we wanted to go was the same place. We wanted equality. We wanted first-class citizenship. We wanted to be respected. We wanted our children to have better schools. All that everybody else wants, you know.
We're telling them that we discovered this country on this side.
But the cabinet committee was not enough.
We're telling them that our parents...
Already, new voices were demanding to be heard. In 1967, Corky Gonzalez expressed the feelings and desires of young Chicanos in an epic poem, I Am Joaquin.
I am Joaquin, lost in a world of confusion, caught up in the whirl of a gringo society. I am the masses of my people, and I refuse to be absorbed. I am Joaquin.
Joaquin is a life of all of our people. Joaquin is one of us and is all of us.
The odds are great, but my spirit is strong. My faith unbreakable. My blood is pure. I am Aztec Prince and Christian Christ. I shall endure. I will endure. And now the trumpet sounds. The music of the people stirs.
For Chicanos, I Am Joaquin was a spiritual and cultural revelation. It was the history they had never learned in school. It was a celebration of their Indian and Spanish ancestry, of their Mexican heroes and American lives.
It's the experience that was so moving, because it was such a strong poem, you know, and yet it called you to action, you know, and I identified greatly with it.
Corky gave soul and spirit, gave it the real spirit of what was Chicano nationalism, which was very positive. If there was an ideology out there, Corky was very much the driving force.
Once you teach a man who he is, and you give him pride in himself, you give him the spirit to stand up, there's no society he can't exist in.
Growing up in the barrios of Denver, Colorado, Corky Gonzalez boxed his way out of poverty. At one time, he was the third-ranked world featherweight contender. Later, he went into business selling bonds and insurance. He also turned to Democratic Party politics. In 1960, he registered unprecedented numbers of Mexican Americans to vote for John F. Kennedy.
Corky's motive for becoming involved in the Democratic Party was to bring about the changes that he wanted to see within the Chicano, within the Mexican community at large.
As director of Denver's War on Poverty program, he encountered a patronage system that offered little more than token jobs to Mexican Americans. After a public feud with the Denver mayor, Gonzalez broke with the Democratic Party in 1966 and began a civil rights organization called the Crusade for Justice. He envisioned a Chicano enterprise independent of government involvement.
As long as we're not antagonized, nor are the young people antagonized by people who don't show no respect for them.
We as an organization were a nationalist organization, which means we put our priority on our community. We felt if Mexicans didn't stick up for Mexicans, no one else was going to.
Our kids are just as smart as anybody else's kids, given the opportunities. And we wouldn't be fighting so hard if our parents before us would have done what we're doing for our children. And they say, well, this is the way it is, you have to accept it. We found out we don't have to accept it. And our kids are not going to. We're not going to settle for this for our kids. We're going to work with them and teach them our new way of life, which is our right.
Corky was a hell of an organizer, you know. I mean, this is a guy who was really making things happen in Denver. I mean, there was a full-fledged community organization that was very sophisticated for its time, operating out of Denver, Colorado. And it was all centered around this guy called Corky Gonzalez, you know, who was one of us.
Corky Gonzalez would soon gain national attention for Chicanos.
We spend in the so-called war on poverty in America only about $53 for each person classified as poor.
Dr. Martin Luther King had made great strides obtaining civil rights for black people. Now he wanted to address poverty with a multiracial coalition. King was planning a Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C. during the spring of 1968. He hoped to unite Americans of all colors under one banner to join in a common fight against poverty. Dr. King invited Corky Gonzalez and Reyes Tijerina to be part of that coalition. Only a few weeks before the campaign took place, King was assassinated.
Where are we going? We're going to try to fulfill Dr. Martin Luther King's dream. And if we Mexican Americans march to Washington, it is to tell this country that poverty is not a Negro problem. Poverty is a Mexican American. Poverty is an American Indian. Poverty is a Puerto Rican. Poverty is an Appalachian problem.
There were several busloads of people from northern New Mexico villages and small towns that were going to go. Some people who had never been out of the state before. It was really something.
Seizing the opportunity, some Chicanos gave voice to the frustrations of their people.
Everybody seems to be taking advantage of us, you know. Our Mexican-American brothers and fathers are the ones that go fight in Vietnam, and then when they come back, they have no jobs, they have nothing here to come back to.
Reyes Tijerina and Corky Gonzalez were leaders for the Southwest contingent of the Poor People's Campaign.
The newspapers is speaking nothing but jobs, jobs, jobs. It doesn't mention land, it doesn't mention treaties.
Tijerina viewed the campaign as a means of bringing the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and his land struggle to Washington's attention.
I would like to state that the Mexican Americans from the Southwest have come here in support of the Poor People's Campaign, to be part of the Poor People's Campaign.
Gonzalez saw a larger objective. He and his followers wanted to create alliances and draw national attention to Chicano issues. But the Poor People's Campaign revealed differences between the participating groups. Without Dr. King's leadership, the campaign was soon floundering. Chicanos became increasingly impatient with the campaign's lack of progress.
Our rights as Spanish Americans and the Indian rights and the poor people, poor whites, are not being represented rightfully.
I would like to say that there is no division in our ranks whatsoever.
Reverend Ralph Abernathy, director of the Poor People's Campaign, tried to resolve the conflict without success. Chicano leaders began setting their own agenda.
It's the Magna Carta versus the Supreme Court of the United States. It's the Indian people and 16,000...
At the Supreme Court, Tijerina called for the recognition of Indian rights.
So we are happy that we made history today.
Ladies and gentlemen of Resurrection City, for 9 years,
Mr. Attorney General,
under the... We have 3 more things, and then I'll be with you.
At the Justice Department, Corky Gonzalez grew impatient with administration rhetoric. Gonzalez challenged Attorney General Ramsey Clark.
When you say there might be discrimination in housing, then that means that you are either naive or blind. I didn't hear you say anything about the juvenile court, kangaroo court, that subjects our children to controls by people who don't care any more about them than except to advise them to go into the U.S. Army or the Navy or Marines.
Corky Gonzalez was emerging as the leading Chicano voice.
Personality-wise, Corky understood the workings of the politics. He was skilled in that. Reyes was so single-minded around his issues that I think it was difficult for him to swim in that atmosphere. Reyes was not an organizer. He was a leader. Corky was a person who could both organize and lead.
6 weeks after it began, the Poor People's Campaign came to an end. It fell victim to its own internal troubles and to a Johnson administration that had become preoccupied with the war in Vietnam to the detriment of domestic poverty issues. Still, many Chicanos viewed their participation as a success.
When issues of civil rights were discussed, you started seeing that the Mexican-American community was mentioned, if not included. And we felt that we did attain that one goal, that we gained national visibility for a group that previously had been considered an invisible minority.
Soon after returning to New Mexico, Reyes Tijerina began a 2-year prison sentence for his role in the takeover of the Carson National Forest.
Because there is nothing but racists. Let's face it. You have to understand that they thought that we couldn't march.
In Denver, Corky Gonzalez and other leaders announced it was time for Chicanos to meet independently and on their own terms.
We came here to build the new Chicano movement. That's what we came here for.
The first Chicano Youth Conference was to take place at Denver in March of 1969. Chicanos everywhere were invited: students, teachers, laborers, barrio youth. The coming event attracted considerable attention, not all of it desired.
And FBI files on the Crusade for Justice showed that that very proposal to convene a national gathering of Latino activists immediately drew the concern of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI.
At that particular point in time, we assumed that we were under surveillance, but we had not yet become paranoid. All the arrest, the persecution, and the attempt to destroy the movement through legal means had not yet taken full hold.
The FBI predicted a poor showing, but the Los Angeles Times expected otherwise and sent veteran reporter Ruben Salazar to cover the event. More than 1,000 came to the meeting, 3 times the Crusade's initial estimate.
That was my first encounter with Texans and Coloradans and New Mexicans and Arizonians. And they were all Mexicans. And then there were Mexicans from Chicago, New York, Kansas. I didn't know there were Mexicans in Kansas.
So this was one of the main purposes, to relate the farm worker struggle, the land struggle, the urban struggle. And in doing that, we forgot a lot about the urban problems. And,
Corky Gonzalez hoped to adopt a plan of action. It would be a nationalist blueprint for self-determination, emphasizing separate Chicano institutions, community-controlled schools, an independent political party, and cultural affirmation.
Every single session would be opened with a poem or with a song. There were dance, there was theater. It was rich, it was stimulating, it was alive and vibrant.
The building was just pulsating with energy and music and chants and the excitement of all these young people together. It was very positive. The thing I remember most, however, is this workshop, a women's workshop,
where, I guess maybe there's 50, 70 women together, Chicanas.
The women began questioning their roles in the Chicano movement.
There was sort of some thinking among some of the leadership that women belonged behind the men, walking behind the men, and their total role was to do nothing but support the men. And there were others who said, hell no. You know, we're the ones who keep it together. We keep it together in our community, we keep it together in our homes, and we're not walking behind nobody.
On the one hand, women were doing the work. They were often in leadership. They had a lot of the ideas, and at the same time, they were often consistently expected to make the food and to do typing, clerical kinds of work.
This debate took the male organizers of the conference by surprise.
We didn't know what they were talking about nor why they felt that way. So due to the pressure of the women, the agendas were changed, meeting places were set, panels were set up, and women had their voice whether or not the men liked it.
The Women's Caucus agreed to press for equality within all aspects of the movement, but rejected a separate organization for Chicana feminists.
Most of us, I'll say the majority, were not at the point of defining ourselves separately in the Chicano movement. There was not a formal position taken, just that it should be understood that women and men would be equal, especially since we were fighting for equality and for the end to racism.
That was as much a rejection of the women's liberation movement of those years, which was seen as, and in many ways was, overwhelmingly middle class and Anglo women, white women, who did not understand racist oppression, did not understand the oppression of whole people, half of whom are male.
In other discussions, some of them very heated, activists debated Marxism and nationalism, but reaffirmed a Chicano identity rooted in ancient Aztec myths.
We didn't want to assimilate it into some melting pot notion in which we had to sacrifice everything, and the dominant society just swallowed us up into some sense of a new American, and we had to give up who we were, and we wanted to define ourselves on our terms.
At night, Alurista, a young poet, was hard at work. Drawing upon Aztec folklore, he drafted a new mythology for Chicanos, describing a symbolic Chicano homeland within the borders of the United States.
I presented it the next day as a poem that I thought encapsulated the spirit of the moment. I never planned anything else. I said, may I read you a poem?
Before the world, before all of North America, before all of our brothers in the Bronze Continent, we are a nation. We are a union of free pueblos. We are Aztlán.
According to legend, the Aztec people had migrated from a place called Aztlán to central Mexico. For Chicanos, Aztlán came to mean the southwestern United States, their homeland.
It was a calling. It was almost like a declaration for us, and a calling to say, you know, we are Aztlán, we are Browns people, we're a nation.
I think of Aztlán still to this day as perhaps the most important premise of the entire movement. It was about a state of being and a place. Every people have a place. And so to say you were Chicano without a place is impossible. So the place was Aztlán.
Aztlán became a call for political power, a call heard when over 1,000 Chicanos marched out of conference headquarters to the state capitol. There, they lowered the Colorado state banner and raised the Mexican flag.
With our hearts in our hands and our hands in the soil, we declare the independence of our mestizo nation.
To outsiders, it looked like Chicanos were turning their back on America. To Chicanos, it meant they were here to stay.
It meant we were home. It meant this was our historic land. It meant this is where we were from. It meant we weren't foreigners. It meant we weren't wetbacks. It meant we weren't illegal aliens. It meant we were in our ancestral land.
We had been educated under mythologies and myths that basically emanated and came out of the American experience. You know. Whatever you had, you know, whether it's Manifest Destiny or the Cherry Tree or whatever myths, you know, energize your culture, we now had something, the myth of Aztlán, it connected us all.
The conference adopted Alurista's poem as the preamble to its 15-point plan. The next step was to make Aztlán a reality. Within a year, the movement was poised to launch an independent political party. The kickoff would coincide with the demonstration against Chicano casualties in Vietnam.
Anti-war demonstrators protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War in mass marches, rallies, and demonstrations. Central Park is the starting point for the parade to the UN building.
President Richard Nixon came to office in 1968, promising to reduce American troops in Vietnam. Instead, he widened the war. Opposition to Vietnam was taking hold in the Chicano community.
We had reached the point where we were going to say that, hey, we don't have to prove ourselves, feel a inferiority complex, and go out and serve in that war.
We're protesting against the discriminatory draft laws that give deferment to all the Anglo middle-class people of this country and make the heaviest burden of the war fall on the poor, fall on the Mexicano.
People were becoming expert at getting out of the war, you know, and so as more and more middle-class people that could afford lawyers began to get deferments, the draft boards filled up their quotas with more of the poor, and particularly Mexican-American.
Mexican-American casualties were disproportionate to their numbers. In the Southwest, Mexican-Americans made up 12% of the population, but accounted for almost 20% of the region's deaths in Vietnam, according to many sources.
There was some dissent in our community about whether or not we should be protesting against the war, but it was generally a generational division. Young people were pretty much against it. Students were almost completely all against it. At the same time, I have to say that there was a very strong military tradition in our community.
Mexican Americans had served with distinction in the U.S. military since the Civil War, and during World Wars I and II received the highest military honors.
So there was and is a deep respect for the military in our community because it was one of the gateways, one of the paths that people took to gain an education, to gain some sort of self-respect. The problem was that the only places where we could go forth and claim a part of being American in this country was by spilling our blood.
And the fatality rate is not consistent with the fact that we have so many inconsistencies as far as social problems here in Los Angeles, in our own nation, our own country.
If you were asked to risk to die for something, what is it you believe in, and what do you owe to that country?
You know, why should you fight over there when our main battle's over here right now?
This is our land. This is our land.
It's easy for the establishment to say, aren't we all the same? Aren't we all Americans? Well, obviously we're not. Otherwise we wouldn't be in the revolutionary process that we are in now.
What, in your estimation, is the most serious problem?
Los Angeles Times columnist Ruben Salazar had been following the Chicano movement ever since the Denver Youth Conference. Chicanos, in turn, were coming to respect his frank commentary.
And when he goes in the army, he goes to...
Salazar now joined Chicanos in vocal opposition to the war.
Many of us are quite grateful that I, for one, probably would never have gone to college if I had not been in the army, thanks to the GI Bill. But the fact remains that we seem to lose more of our people in Vietnam in proportion to the rest of the population.
A Chicano Moratorium Committee was formed to build momentum against the war.
The idea came up, why don't we have a national meeting and start developing how we nationally do something against the war? So let's have our own Chicano moratorium.
They held anti-war rallies in Chicago, San Francisco, Austin, and Houston, with a major demonstration slated for Los Angeles in August 1970. A moratorium march. Afterwards, Corky Gonzalez and others hoped to convene the first meeting of an all-Chicano political party.
In many ways, the Moratorium March was the apex of the Chicano movement. And it was a moment in which we all felt that we had to speak. And the war was the single most important issue that was confronting the country at the time.
On August 29th, 25,000 to 30,000 Chicanos gathered in Los Angeles to protest the war in Vietnam.
There was a couple getting married at the St. Alphonsus Church. They timed their wedding so they could come right out of the church into the march. Ruben Salazar was there, and he came up right in the middle of, right at Whittier and Atlantic, in the middle of the street, gave me a big thing. Well, you did it.
After a 4.5-mile march, the demonstrators gathered at Laguna Park.
Everybody was there greeting their friends, greeting their families, people that they may, relatives they may not have seen in a long time that they happened to see August 29th.
During the afternoon rally, a disturbance erupted at a local liquor store.
According to the police story, some people went into a liquor store and walked out with some six-packs and went towards the park. And supposedly the shop owner called into the police. The police came and started chasing the people that supposedly took the beer, and the people ran into the park, and then the police wanted to go get them, but the people in the park wouldn't move out of the way, so they had to call more police and declare it an illegal assembly. That was their pretext that they used, to break up a demonstration of 25,000, 30,000 people against the war in Vietnam and in East LA. So you had a panic, you had a stampede, a human stampede.
lot of destruction took place on both sides. The police called it a Chicano riot. The people called it a police riot.
Demonstrators found refuge in nearby homes or in local businesses as police forced people out of the park and into the streets.
I was in the restroom with little children that were there. They were very scared. They were crying. The mother had never seen such a thing.
Deputy Sheriff Thomas Wilson responded to a report that an armed person was in the Silver Dollar Bar on Whittier Boulevard.
When I approached the doorway, I knew I had a tear gas projectile and the weapon. I wanted to get something inside, and I wanted to get it inside quick. I attempted to aim up towards the ceiling to bounce the projectile to the rear of the bar.
Some people inside never heard the orders to come out. Among them, Ruben Salazar.
Sometime later, after the gas cleared, the information was received that the victim, Mr. Salazar, was inside the location and had been injured. The officers investigated and they found that he was dead and was lying approximately 20 to 25 feet inside the front door.
The deputy sheriff's tear gas canister hit Salazar in the head, killing him.
If it was an accident, it happened because the lives of Mexican people were considered worthless. So that you could fire a huge tear gas projectile into a bar, a public place, and not worry about it. It happened that it took off Ruben Salazar's head.
Chicanos mourned the loss of a friend and their only ally in the mainstream media. The death of Ruben Salazar had a profound impact on the Chicano movement.
I think that the sheriffs, proved the point that for the Chicano, the war is more here in the struggle for justice than over in Vietnam.
We had considered the possibility of violence, being that there were so many people, but certainly not deaths.
200 people were arrested, 60 were wounded, 3 died, and plans to create an all-Chicano political party were postponed.
We've lost a certain heart. We lost a certain innocence of our ideals, that we could engage the country through the country's own ideals of the Bill of Rights, the ideals that the country was supposedly founded on, and that we could be killed.
All people who are struggling for more social justice, it's a long struggle. But there are traditions that get set, there are concepts that get established, there's visions that get put out, there's dreams that get dreamed. And just having those in our lives and in our minds is a victory in itself.
All of a sudden, one morning, everybody got up, and the whole world had changed in Delano.
The word will go forth all over the country. It'll go to all parts of California.
Caesar came along at the right time, and he was in the right place, and he was the right person.
We'll win the election, you guys take off.
His qualities as a leader inspired a kind of leadership that other people in the farm working area had not been able to achieve. For one thing, I mean, he was a Chicano himself. He was a farm worker.
September 1965. Mexican-American farm workers walked off the fields and refused to pick grapes at many California vineyards. They were tired of exploitation and inhumane treatment. They demanded the same opportunities that other Americans had: a living wage, education for their children, decent housing, to live without fear. They staked their claim by shouting huelga, the Spanish word for strike. It soon became the battle cry for the Chicano movement. The San Joaquin Valley is a fertile agricultural region stretching 500 miles through the center of California. In the early 1960s, migrant farm workers who picked crops in these rich fields knew only misery and poverty.
Mr. Pena, how much do you earn a year?
Oh, well, about $2,500 a year. You know.
How much education have you had?
None.
Never been to school?
Well, yeah, a few years and so.
Can you read?
Not too good.
How much have you been getting for a day's work?
Only $2.
$2 a day?
Yes.
You have a little boy. Would you like him to be a farm worker?
No, sir. I've been working all my life in fields, and I don't think it'd be the best place for him. I'd like for him to get a good education.
Farm workers, unfortunately, were considered just another item in producing products like fertilizer or boxes or water. Most growers didn't treat their workers with any degree of respect or dignity.
The life of a migrant farm worker was harsh. Long days of back-breaking work in the hot sun, exposure to poisonous pesticides, all for substandard wages. Life expectancy was 49 years. Education was usually limited to 2 or 3 years of school because children often had to work in the fields with their parents. The farm worker was trapped in a vicious cycle of poverty and illiteracy.
I grew up into an agricultural area that was segregated in a sense that it separated farmers from farm workers, and it separated the races completely.
My family, they were migrant workers, but that is very, very difficult because you absolutely have no control of your living conditions, and there's just no way of knowing what the crop season is going to be like. Just like all my brothers and sisters, and just like most of the people in the community, we all grew up in the fields. The only way that we could really put some roots down and to get an education was to have like a home base, because that was one of the things that we saw, that with the migrant families in particular, that they were pulled out of school all the time and they just really didn't have a chance to get much of an education.
Economic rights are the essence of human rights. First of all, every study shows you that without economic rights, you don't have educational rights. When you are in a rural area, you're very vulnerable, especially if you are living from hand to mouth. There is very little integration of other ideas that's taking place when you're constantly moving. You never form a sense of place. You're constantly worrying if you're going to have enough money to pay for the gas, or you're going to have enough money to buy the food. It's a tremendous feeling of isolation, fear, where a rancher can do almost anything that they want with you.
Past efforts to sustain a union among farm workers in California had failed. In 1964, U.S. officials put a stop to the Bracero program, which had allowed the legal importation of temporary farm workers from Mexico. The end of the Bracero program reduced the workforce available to growers, and California farm labor organizers saw an opportunity. In the summer of 1965, Filipino workers called a wildcat strike against grape growers in the Coachella Valley, 150 miles to the east of Los Angeles.
The strike was won in 1 week because Coachella is a hot country and grapes ripen by the seconds, almost by the seconds. So what you did not pick today, it is ready tomorrow, waiting for us to come in. Come on and pick me, I'm ready.
The Coachella growers quickly gave in to the Filipinos' demand for $1.40 an hour. Now the workers set their sights on the grape harvest to the north, near the town of Delano. With a large Mexican-American workforce available to them, Delano growers refused the Filipinos' demand for a wage increase. Striking Filipinos quickly discovered that they had lost jobs and shelter as well.
Our home was right there in the camps. Growers threw out the belongings of some of those strikers in the camp where they are, outside of the rooms, locked their rooms. We sleep in our cars, under the trees surrounding the community hall.
The Filipinos knew their strike would fail without the support of the NFWA, the National Farm Workers Association, a recently formed organization of Mexican-American farm workers.
Our plan had been to quietly organize like for 5 years and to try to get the whole San Joaquin Valley organized before we even talked about doing anything like a strike. Then when the strike happened, well, everything, just changed.
With the Filipinos on strike, Mexican-Americans now had a decision to make. Most considered it a no-win situation. There was no strike fund, farm workers had no savings, there was no money to support a walkout for even a few days. In Delano, families lived on a day-to-day basis, constantly on the edge. The strike could be a financial disaster.
To get involved, you had an awful lot to lose because the bosses of the fields were threatening everybody left and right that they would lose their jobs or they would not be hired, or there were even threats of deportation for some of the people who were like more recent arrivals. So it was pretty frightening on that level.
I mean, there were times when people were afraid to meet in their homes, that you had to go meet somewhere else, like in a park or down by the river or something, because they were afraid if somebody would find out and tell the labor contractor or the grower and they would get fired.
The NFWA called a strike meeting to see whether they would officially join the strike. And it was on September 16th, which, as you know, is Mexican Independence Day. And for any good Mexican, September 16th, I mean, we're all feeling full of revolutionary fervor and patriotism, and people started talking about how unfair what the growers were doing and why we needed to fight back. And Then a guy gets up and starts talking. I said, oh, that must be Caesar. And he was tall with a mustache, very distinguished looking. I was very impressed. And then he says, now I want to introduce you to Cesar Chavez. And so then Caesar gets up, and he's this little guy, you know, he's very soft-spoken. That's Caesar? You know, I wasn't very impressed, but the more he talked, the more I thought that not only could we fight, but we could win.
We'll never stop. Our job will not be done until every farm worker is organized.
That was fertile ground. I mean, we were angry. Many of us were afraid. Many of us didn't know what to do. But we were just waiting. We were somebody just waiting for somebody to throw a match. And that's what Caesar did.
El día 8 de septiembre de los campos de Deleno salieron los filipinos. Y después de 2 semanas para unirse a la batalla.
The National Farm Workers Association voted to join the strike. With only $87 in its treasury, union leaders prayed that the work stoppage would be brief. Farm workers tightened their belts and bravely faced an uncertain future. Workers were thinking of the strike in terms of days or even weeks, not years.
My family realized that we weren't going anywhere, that we had a lot at stake, and that we had to basically stay and fight. That even, like my mother said, even if we starved to death, that we would not be alone, but that we had to stay and fight, because otherwise nothing was going to change.
Viva la revolución, arriba con nuestra unión, viva huelga en general.
All I can say is that the men have to be the judges of their own, what they want. And these men have chosen this type of work, just like farming. Anybody will tell you the farmers are taking the poorest of economics, but yet this is my choice. So the same with these workers. They have chosen this way of life, and if they were not happy, they wouldn't be here.
Not all growers were nice people. They just wanted to get their job done. Others were very compassionate to their workers. And so you can't just categorize them all as bad guys or good guys.
We came from a hard-working family, poor people. A lot poorer than a lot of these workers that work for us. Of course, it was a different time, a different period, but we were sympathetic to the working person because we did it.
Most of the growers in the Delano area settled there in the 1920s and 30s. They came from Southern and Eastern Europe.
Every one of these growers, such as my father and others, they were immigrants. They came here with nothing but their hands. And so they were sympathetic to the worker, and they wanted to be fair. What we can't afford, we can't give.
Land was cheap because at the time the valley was a semi-desert, an ideal climate for grapes and other crops requiring year-round attention by farm workers. In 1951, the growers received a windfall when the federal government brought water into the San Joaquin Valley, in effect subsidizing the growers' irrigation needs. This abundant water supply dramatically increased the valley's yield and transformed small farms into thriving agricultural businesses.
I worked in a lettuce patch when I was 13 years old. It's back-breaking work, and it's hot work, and it's dirty work.
My memories working as a child in the fields would be summarized in long, long hours, hot fields, having to work in hot fields, feeling that that was it, that's what it was gonna be. You know, it was gonna be always working in the fields. You know, we live in horrible conditions, we get paid lousy wages, our kids don't have any kind of hope of going to college or being something different if they want to be something different.
Basically, we were seen as being ignorant, as being lazy, as being stupid, as being dirty. And that's why we were farm workers. And that's why we were poor.
There was a natural scenario for bitterness by farm workers who felt they were treated with, in some cases, with humiliation, were fired without cause. Perhaps there weren't adequate toilet facilities or fresh water. And those were all things that were legitimate grievances by workers that farmers were negligent to improve upon.
The NFWA pleaded, cajoled, and sometimes embarrassed reluctant farm workers into joining the walkout. To be successful, the strike needed a strong, unified stand against growers who had power and money on their side.
Read it and sign it. Les corté un papel para cada uno.
3 weeks after the walkouts, close to 3,000 farm workers were on strike, affecting dozens of farms in the southern San Joaquin Valley.
We're fighting for recognition, which is the real guts of it. It doesn't matter now how much money they're offered. They wouldn't go back because what they want is a union before they go back.
Let me ask you this. What do you think of the idea of a union for farm workers?
I think it's ridiculous.
Why do you say that?
Well, I won't go into that with you either. You ask me what I think. This is what I think. I will say this. Farm wages in the last 12 months right in this area has increased from $1.10 to $1.60 an hour.
Isn't that because of the strike?
No, that's nothing whatever to do with it.
What is that because of?
I'm not going to go on into these questions with you.
One other question. Do you think that without a union, the farm workers can improve their condition and create better?
It has been done right here, quite a bit.
Is this camp evidence of that?
This camp has greatly improved in the last year.
Would you want to
Since I have been here.
Would you want to live in this camp?
I wouldn't live here. You know, you're being very impudent. Would I want to live here? This is, I call, an impudent question.
The growers fought back, bringing in replacement workers by the busload, attacking strikers with legal injunctions.
We have to be 60 feet from that property line, 60 feet from this property line, which puts us somewhere up in the air. For all intents and purposes, we have no right to picket.
The reason we couldn't win the strike in the fields was because the growers had access to an endless supply of strikebreakers. They had all kinds of access to injunctions that would limit the effectiveness of our picket lines so that we couldn't speak to the strikebreakers. So if we can't stop the grapes here, where they're being harvested, then where can we stop it? And so logically, the next place to stop it would be where it goes.
Strike leaders took their struggle out of the fields and into the marketplace, calling for a nationwide consumer boycott against grapes and grape products.
As long as you're fighting solely on grower turf, you're fighting, in effect, with one hand tied behind your back. So when you start to boycott, what you're doing is you're expanding the playing field.
Out of more than 30 growers being struck, 2 were targeted for boycotts. Shenley Ranch, owned by Seagram's, and the DiGiorgio Corporation, which produced Tree Sweet and S&W products.
You've got to get out there with a picket sign and get some action going. And when you put all of those things together, then nonviolence works. And the only way I know to organize...
As the strike continued, it became more than a labor issue, and Cesar Chavez became more than a labor leader.
We know that those of you who came from the outside, from distant places to be with us, you have come here at sacrifices to yourselves and to your families. Believe me, we appreciate your efforts, and we invite you to come with us and come and visit us again and again here in Delano, where you have many, many friends now.
Cesar also made it a movement, a civil rights movement, and he made this clear that it was a civil rights movement. It was not just another union. You see, it was just not another labor strike. He was a national civil rights leader. And he was talking about the same things as Martin Luther King, nonviolence. He was talking about human rights. that went beyond just the economic aspect that unions operate. Getting more wages, better labor conditions. How about the children? How about the racism in the school? You see, how about the local cops? And these are the things that the farm workers were about.
Que el amor debe ser vivido en las acciones de los hombres.
Responding to the boycott, the Senate Migratory Subcommittee opened hearings to investigate the plight of farm workers. Senator Robert Kennedy interrogated the local sheriff, trying to understand why striking workers were being arrested.
If I have reason to believe that there's going to be a riot started and somebody tells me that there's going to be trouble if you don't stop them, then it's my duty to stop them.
Well, then you go out and arrest them?
Well, absolutely.
And charge them?
Charge them.
What do you charge them with?
Violating unlawful assemblage.
Who told you that they're going to riot?
The men right out in the field that they were talking to said, if you don't get them out of here, we're going to cut their hearts out. So rather than let them get cut, you remove the cause.
This is the most interesting concept, I think. The fact that somebody makes a report about somebody's going to get out of order, perhaps violate the law, and you go in and arrest them. They haven't done anything wrong. How can you go arrest somebody if they haven't violated the law?
They're ready to violate the law, in other words.
Could I suggest from the luncheon period of time that the sheriff and the district attorney read the Constitution of the United States?
Two significant things came out of those hearings. One was just the fact that Bobby Kennedy came to Delano. And he got to meet Caesar, he got to meet the other leaders of the National Farm Workers Association. And secondly, the hearings just gave visibility to the Delano strike. I mean, it did the opposite of what the growers wanted. The growers wanted invisibility and localization and, crush it locally. That's the strategy. For the strikers, the more statewide and national publicity, the better.
We have to come clearly to the conclusion that an ignored part of our population have been the farm workers. That the farm workers have suffered in our society over the period of the last 30 years, and that situation has to be changed.
Farm workers had been on strike for 5 months with no solution in sight. Union leaders needed to find a new way to win over the American public. Cesar Chavez decided to make a peregrinación, a pilgrimage. Starting in Delano, he planned to march 300 miles to the state capital in Sacramento. Along the way, he hoped to recruit enough men, women, and children to focus national attention on the farm workers' cause. Marchers realized that their route would pass through hostile territory in the heart of the San Joaquin Valley.
Con el escandor hermoso de nuestra guadalupana, van marchando a Sacramento, nuestra gente mexicana.
It opened the farm worker struggle beyond Delano, and it was to take the message of the farm worker struggle to farm workers all up and down the valley. The other thing that it did was take head on the fear that most people felt in the valley. So you kind of grew up or lived with this kind of unspoken fear of knowing that there was this side and that side of the tracks, that there were places you couldn't go, that there were ways you would be treated.
The San Joaquin Valley is full of those limitations, of those barriers and those lines that you never crossed. Well, this march crossed them. It crossed them all. It was, to me, a literal taking of the territory.
As the marchers passed through each town, more and more sympathizers came out to join their pilgrimage. Each night along the route, they attended rallies and listened to updates on the boycotts against Shenley and DeGiorgio.
resolver el problema de la huelga en Delano.
Each morning began with Mass, and then the marchers fell in behind the patron saint of the Mexican people, the Virgin of Guadalupe.
She represented the very soul of the people. It fused everybody into one raza, so to speak. But it also legitimized us in the sense that it told the world, okay, we are followers of the Virgen de Guadalupe, we're not followers of Karl Marx.
These religious gestures angered many of the growers, who normally knelt and prayed in the same churches as the marchers.
You're talking about people that attended St. Mary's Catholic Church in Delano, along with Caesar. You know, that's where I was baptized. I mean, along with all the farm workers. And they considered themselves to be on the side of God, like everybody else. These are good people. These are good, hard-working immigrant descendants. So when Caesar began to implement the uses of religious imagery in his struggle, many of the growers resented it, took it personally. They said, we are not the devil. We are also Catholics. Consequently, the church, in trying to relate to this struggle, found itself torn. On the one hand, there was this very powerful, moneyed, and political constituency that the growers represented that was important to the church. And on the other hand, these were the poor, the working poor.
1, 2, 3, go!
At rallies along the march, the farm workers' theater, Teatro Campesino, performed skits ridiculing the growers. Originally created on the picket lines, the teatro now recruited local farm workers to be actors in the plays.
Hello, baby! Hey, baby, don't do that, boy!
I found out that one of the hardest things for me to do was to get campesinos to act like growers.
Boy! How would you like to be a rancher for a daddy? Oh, no, you're not. Oh, no, you're not.
But the moment that they did the boss, they changed. They became better organizers. They became like confident and in control of themselves. And Caesar saw this. So the teatro started to develop a lot of the early organizers that the union sent to places, sent them out into cities to work on the boycott, or sent them out to other areas to organize farm workers, who became a source of organizers, just strictly on the strength of self-expression, of speech and drama.
That was the very first time in my life that I had ever seen art being used on that level. And it made a major impact on me.
We still claim that there are Reds and agitators. Hold on. Among you Mexicans.
Chicano art had a very, very important role within the Chicano movement. It gave visual form to our dreams, our aspirations, our struggles. Because we did not own the media, we didn't own the television, we didn't own the radio, we didn't own the movies, we owned nothing at all. The only way that we could, in many respects, get the word out, be visible, was to create posters, murals, paintings, banners, whatever. It took that form, and in that way we were able to disseminate information. You know, not only the positive things, but the negative things. I mean, who we are, our indigenous roots, and our connection to the land, our love of family and home and community.
"21 days into the march, the line of demonstrators stretched for miles through the San Joaquin Valley, and news arrived from Delano. The Schenley Corporation, concerned about negative publicity for its Seagram's label, was ready to negotiate. The farm workers had won their first victory.
How'd you feel when you stopped all of a sudden? They told you that Shenley had
No, I felt
given
like hugging everybody, man. I mean, you know, all of us that were all together, we were all marching and everything. We were just about giving up hope, man. We didn't think anybody would, you know, cooperate. But when we heard about it, we were real happy.
Well, I sure felt good by God. All the work I done for it.
What it signaled to us was that we could win, that this was really possible, that we could change things. We believed it in our hearts, but this was the affirmation of that belief.
This morning at 10 o'clock,
The other boycott target, DiGiorgio Fruit Corporation, still refused to negotiate.
they announced that they will not recognize the association and they will not bargain with us. So, que siga la huelga.
1966. After 25 days on the road, 10,000 marchers arrive at the state capitol in Sacramento. It was a triumphant moment in the history of farm labor. As he had done so many times during the march, Cesar Chavez read from the Plan of Delano, which clearly laid out objectives of the farm workers' movement.
The Mexican race has sacrificed itself for the last 100 years. Our sweat and our blood have fallen on this land to make other men rich. This pilgrimage we make symbolizes the long historical road we have traveled in this valley alone, and the long road we have yet to travel.
August 1967. The farm workers had been on strike for almost 2 years. After a bitter struggle, the DiGiorgio Corporation finally signed a contract with the farm workers. But 28 other growers still refused to negotiate.
We still had this strike going on, and the grape companies, they had not sat down to bargain with us. And we decided then to go after the biggest grape grower, which was Jamara, who has about 4,000 workers.
John Jamara Sr. had a whole panoply of legal forces, and they got an injunction, which limited our picketing. So the strike was somewhat weakened. We then decided that we were going to boycott Jamara's label, and we started boycotting just Jamara grapes.
But then Jamara started using everybody's labels. So before you knew it, we were like boycotting like 58 labels or something.
So we started to boycott the whole industry, since the whole industry seemed to be coming to Jamara's aid.
The whole point of the boycott was to put enough economic pressure on the growers to get them to sit down and talk. That's all we wanted, was to get them to sit down and talk like reasonable people about what conditions and what wages people would work for.
I know of no grower in the Delano area who has refused or who would refuse to sit down and to talk with the workers on his farm, whether it's dealing with wages or housing or other working conditions.
But not with the union organization.
But they do not feel that the organizer and the agitators represent their workers. And there have been no indication on the part of the workers themselves working on the grower's farm that they wish these organizers to represent them.
As farm workers looked for broader support, they faced a world they knew little about.
When we went out, we had to lose all shame and be willing to ask for everything. And we were asking people to quit their jobs and drop out of school and come work with us full time. We were asking people to give us money. We were asking people to let us live in their home and sleep on their floor. We were asking people to feed us. And we were asking for paper for leaflets. Anything you could think of, we were asking for because we didn't have it. And we needed it in order to do the boycott.
The longest time was in Chicago. Caesar told me, just go out and stop the grapes and you can come home. I didn't know what that meant. I mean, I was 21 years old, never been to any big city by myself, had no idea where Chicago was. And they gave me a bag of buttons, one name of a supporter in Illinois, and something like $15, $20. I had no idea how I was going to live or support myself. My whole world had been a Spanish-speaking world, a farm worker world. And all of a sudden I had to go out and meet church people and unions and white people and all kinds of people. It's a big experience.
There were so many people that before the farm workers' boycott began, they hadn't stopped to think about where the things that they ate came from and who was involved in getting the food on their table.
The public really responded. They were very, very supportive. And then we took that support and put it and put pressure on the chain stores. We started then telling people, don't patronize this store. Go somewhere else where they will take a stand.
The retail food industry is sympathetic to their cause. We understand what their problem is, but we just can't subject ourselves to the demands that they're making. We tried to work with them, but they're not willing to listen.
Little by little, the boycott strategies took hold in cities across the country as mayors and religious leaders came to support the farm workers' cause.
Therefore, we have supported this great boycott in New York.
Soon, Americans from all walks of life began to support the boycott. The FFL-CIO joined in, and the boycott spread to Europe. In England, Sweden, and France, dock workers refused to unload California grapes. For young Chicanos and Chicanas in the cities, the farm worker movement became a pivotal experience. Many young people went to Delano and came away with a new sense of what it meant to be Chicano.
I think it was the Farm Workers Union that really became the heart and soul of the Chicano movement, because it was the most visible in many instances, because it was the most vulnerable, because again we were supposed to have been the most ignorant and unorganized and isolated, and I can go on, yet people were still out there taking a stand in some of the most dangerous, brutal, vicious conditions that you can imagine. And yet people were out there. So I think they were really an inspiration.
Throughout the nation, farm workers had won support by nonviolent efforts, using pickets, boycotts, and marches. But back home, patience was wearing thin.
The strike started in September of 1965, and 2.5 years later, we were still on strike. It's a very long time for people to be on a picket line, a very long time for people to be without things, without basic things. And so some folks were starting to say, well, maybe this nonviolence thing isn't going to work.
Another winter arrived, a hungry time for striking farm workers. Cesar Chavez was deeply troubled by union members who talked openly of using violence against growers.
Caesar had read Gandhi. Caesar followed Martin Luther King in the South, and Caesar thought that the same tactics could be applied in an agricultural dispute.
How long have you scabbed on your fellow workers? You say probably somebody else is going to win my battles and I'm going to gain by it. That's not the point. If everybody thought that way, there wouldn't be a strike. We'll still be in the same lovely condition we were. We're not trying to...
As voices grew angry, Chavez made a pivotal decision. On Valentine's Day 1968, he began a fast, refusing all solid food, drinking only water. It was the ultimate nonviolent act, but it confused many of his followers.
We didn't have a coherent union yet. Now, Caesar decided that since the rumblings were going on, he was going to show people what Guts was all about. And he announced one day that he was going to march out to the gas station at the 40 acres in Delano and fast so people could think about nonviolence.
It was a complete stunner. There weren't enough hours in the day, enough days in the week to do the work, just to keep the Union moving forward. And here is the founder of the Union, the leader of the Union, saying, time out. There was a lot of grumbling about the fact that we needed Caesar as the leader of the day-to-day operation of the Union, and some felt that we didn't need a visionary at this point, or we didn't need a dreamer, or we didn't need a martyr, or we didn't need some type of religious figure of some sort. But we needed a hard-nosed organizer, a day-to-day person who was going to give direction and keep us moving.
We had a press conference with all of the labor leaders in New York to tell them about the boycott, this all-great boycott that we're going to be doing, but also at the same time to let them know that Caesar is fasting. They got very upset. I mean, some of them became almost physical, you know. What's the matter with this guy? Is he crazy, you know? That isn't the way that you organize a union. And in Delano, a lot of the volunteers that had come to help us, they left. They left because Caesar was fasting. Because some people, some religious people that we had, they said, oh, he's trying to play God. They couldn't understand the spiritual power of the fast.
And it forced folks to reflect on the struggle and where it was at that point and whether or not we wanted to continue with it and whether or not we were willing to continue sacrificing in order to build the Union.
Chavez was ordered to appear in court for a hearing to determine if the Union had violated an injunction by picketing the Jamara farm. Almost 2 weeks into his fast, Chavez was weak, and his health had suffered.
I remember waking up that morning and feeling pretty damn scared because here I had a guy, my client, who's on the 13th day of a fast, and I didn't know if these jerks were going to throw him in jail. So I went to pick him up early, and I remember it was a foggy morning, and coming out of the fog, the headlights of farm workers' cars started coming, and they just came endlessly. I felt so great to see all those workers headed to the courthouse. And we had about 3,000 workers at the Kern County Courthouse. They were lining the walls. They were very quiet. And Jamara's attorneys wanted to kick us out. And the presiding judge that day was a guy named Judge Osborne. And I remember going into his chambers and arguing with this guy, Bill Quinlan, Jamara's lawyers. And Osborne said, basically, you know, Bill, if we kick these workers out, it'll be just another example of goddamn gringo justice. That fast transformed enemy territory into our territory because just the presence of 3,000 peaceful, nonviolent farm workers in the courthouse changed the attitude that the workers in the courthouse had toward the farm workers. They weren't misbehaving. They were human beings. So I think that Caesar's commitment to nonviolence did a lot of things. First, the general support of the American people was dependent on it. The boycott was dependent on it. But more importantly, that fast and that commitment, I think it was the glue that made the Union a union.
After 25 days, Chavez broke his fast at a mass attended by 4,000 supporters. Senator Robert Kennedy was at his side. 3 months later, Kennedy was killed. Farm workers lost a friend and one of their strongest supporters.
Bobby Kennedy's assassination was just a morale blow to all of us. It just was like a 2x4 to the head. Because he was not only a public figure, you know, to give visibility to this cause, but it was in his heart, and you could tell.
By 1969, the farm worker strike was in its 4th year. Jamara and the other growers, undaunted by the national grape boycott or the strike, still refused to recognize the Farm Workers Union. And they found a powerful ally in the newly elected governor of California, Ronald Reagan.
There is no grape strike. No one's been able to find anyone picketing the vineyards who ever worked in them. And the only contracts that were signed between Mr. Chavez's union and a few wineries that signed up under the coercion of his threats of boycott.
The farm workers, faced with dwindling resources and low morale, renewed their efforts in many U.S. cities to expand the national grape boycott.
What they did, they went to the East Coast. They went to New York. You have to remember, this was a time of the Vietnam War, the radical movement to the left. There was a strong movement of this type.
Well, they had hundreds and hundreds of people scattered in at least 50 cities, and they were pressuring supermarkets and retailers not to handle grapes.
By early 1970, the boycott began having an effect. Shipments to the top grape-consuming cities were down by 22% and continuing to fall.
His boycott became tougher and tougher and tighter. And I could see it meant destruction for most of the growers.
In Chicago, Eliseo Medina realized that all his hard work was finally producing results.
There was an announcement made by the chain stores. They were going to stop selling grapes. They're going to stop selling grapes. And then it's, oh my God, so we call California. You know what there is? Just said, we just got the same reports from Detroit and from New York and from all of these places. Reports started coming in that chain stores were doing this.
That's what killed us. And we had stores tell us, look, we can be sympathetic to you, but we cannot tolerate this kind of damage. That's what brought us to our knees, not our workers.
It is my belief that in friendship with Cesar Chavez and with his workers, that this will be a constructive solution to the problem.
On April 1st, the National Farm Workers Association signed a contract with Lionel Steinberg of the Freedman Ranches.
I will try as hard as they will try.
We did feel that he would be probably the first one to sign a contract, and he was, because he did have a liberal reputation. And also was a lot better with his workers than some of the other growers were. We knew he was a man with a conscience.
I had the union label, and immediately some of my customers, much to my surprise, started telephoning. They wanted to buy my grapes. And in this respect, I did have a temporary advantage, because my grapes are worth $1 or $2 a box more than the non-union grapes were.
The dynamic of having union grapes reinforced the power of the boycott, because stores didn't want farm workers picketing in front of their front door. They didn't want any hassle, so they bought the union grapes. So the price of union grapes went up. There was a premium on union grapes, and the price of non-union grapes went to hell.
My competitors were very bitter. Here, Steinberg is getting $2 a box more, and he can go to New York, he can go to Chicago, he can go to Boston, he can go to all these closed-up cities, and we can't do it. So several of the growers said, this is too good, we better get on the act, too.
You know, the union has a little black eagle. That's our union label, and growers were clamoring for that eagle. And then all of a sudden, these growers who had hated our guts fell in love with us, and we couldn't sign contracts fast enough with them.
In July, the union's attorney, Jerry Cohen, received a late-night call from John Jamara Jr. He and his father wanted to meet with Cesar Chavez.
So we went to a room at the Stardust Hotel in Delano, and John Jamara Sr. and Jr. came and said that they were interested in signing a contract with us. That was 12,000 acres of grapes. We were dying to get them, but we decided what we'll do is we'll tell John Jamara, we won't even sit down with you unless you round up every Delano grower. And we thought, well, this is pushing it, but why not? So we went to the meeting, and in the middle of the night, we said, you round up all Delano. And their response was, we'll have them at the St. Mary's School tomorrow morning.
Cesar assigned me to do negotiations. And I guess the growers complained about me. First of all, I think that they weren't used to dealing with women.
And she's a Mexican woman. What could be worse from a grower's point of view? Dolores always stuck to her guns. And they said, they being the grower, said Dolores drove him nuts. But I think the reason she drove him nuts is because she, more than anybody, stood for things that they couldn't stand. I mean, their workers were standing up to them.
You know, some of the other people, like the attorneys, like Jerry Cohen, would say, well, you have to be polite. You know, their attorneys, you have to be polite to them. And my thinking is, why do we need to be polite to people who are making racist statements at the table or are making sexist comments? I mean, I think when they do that, you have to call them out, because then also you're educating them in the process so they can stop that kind of behavior.
I'd say in some circles she was known as the Dragon Lady among the growers, because she was the toughest of the bunch. So see, they didn't call her Dolores, they said the Dragon Lady.
On July 29, 1970, the growers and farm workers met to sign the contracts at the Union Hall in Delano, almost 5 years after the strike had begun.
It was a happy day and a great victory for the farm workers.
We had been working so hard for so long for this that it was hard to believe that we'd won.
It never, ever, ever, ever crossed my mind that it couldn't happen. Not once. I always knew that we would be able to do it. And I think Caesar felt the same way.
26 Delano growers signed contracts guaranteeing farm workers $1.80 per hour plus 20 cents a box, a hiring hall, seniority, and strict pesticide controls.
The boycott, the strike has been a costly thing not only to us but also to the employers. But I think that because, even though however unfortunate the experience might have been and the struggle on both sides, that because of that experience we have created the foundation to what I think is going to be a very good working relationship with the grower community in Delano.
10,000 miles begins with a single step. You've taken that single step. I wish you luck on the balance of the trip, and I hope that with this foundation, you can move on to greater things, and we'll prosper, and so will you.
The signing of the table grape contracts was pretty heady stuff.
Not all growers were happy with the outcome.
I felt that I betrayed my workers. And the time when we did sign with him, that was not my workers' option. That was mine, my brother's. I wouldn't have done it. I'd rather die that day, I think, than have done it. But we did.
Is this the turning point?
Well, it's certainly the beginning, I guess. It's a turning point in one respect, and that's that I think that now there's no dispute that we do have a union, but we have an awful lot of work to do.
There was more work to do. The vast majority of farm workers remained without a union, a condition that would mobilize organizing efforts for years. But in the cities and schools of America, inspired by the courage of the farm workers, a generation of Chicano youth were poised to open a new chapter in the Mexican-American struggle for civil rights. They were ready to take to the streets to demand a better education. In the fields, the farm workers' movement had left a lasting legacy of change.
I think the greatest achievement is in the change that it made on people, teaching them how they could fight, how they could stand up for their rights and win.
1968 was a time in which the entire planet was feeling the reverberations of a new spirit. Certainly it was going on in Mexico. It was going on in France. It was going on all over the United States with students of every single state and college and town demanding that there was and had to be a better alternative to what was going on in the world at that time. The Vietnam War was a big issue for everybody, particularly for Chicanos, because we were dying there in higher proportions to anyone else. And no one was acknowledging that. So that our contributions didn't mean anything to the country. And we saw reflected in the world that people thought that something could be done. And we felt that we had to do what we could do with our lives as well. That was the time in 1968.
There was never a school term like this one. It began with a simple protest by students who wanted a better education. School officials became involved, and the parents, then the police, and the FBI. Before long, school children were branded as subversives, their lives threatened, all because they wanted a better education. East Los Angeles. In the 1960s, this was home to almost 100,000 Mexican Americans. It was the largest barrio in the United States.
Growing up in East Los Angeles, I wasn't actually aware of it as a young child, but it soon became apparent that I grew up in a very isolated, very segregated neighborhood, a community that was totally separate from the rest of Los Angeles.
Education was seen as a way to break down those barriers, a way for young people to one day have what everyone else had.
I was buying into this whole thing about the American dream, get an education, you can be whatever you want to be, and you know, read all these books and listen to the teachers. Even though at the back of my mind I was saying something's going on here, you know, the reality that I see here is different from what you're saying.
Something was definitely wrong. Only 1 out of 4 Chicanos completed high school.
The dropout rate was really kind of what some people called a push-out rate. I mean, these were students who were being pushed out of school because their needs weren't being met, their culture was not addressed, the school really wasn't doing anything for them.
Unemployment was almost double the national average. Those who worked earned about 2/3 of what other Los Angeles residents earned. These conditions had a dramatic impact on Mexican American children.
I started elementary school in the early 1950s, and I was the only student in my kindergarten class that was a monolingual Spanish-speaking child. And I was immediately led to the front of the class, and I was instructed on how to create a cone hat out of construction paper. The teacher painted a word on it and told me I could take it off when I learned to speak English, and the word she had painted on that was the word Spanish.
I remember going to elementary school, taking my tacos of frijoles and meat and rice and being made fun of by the other kids in junior high especially, to the point where I didn't want to take tacos de carne to school. I wanted to take bologna sandwiches.
I remember feeling ashamed, when my father would go to school because he didn't speak good English, and translating for him. Feeling ashamed of being Mexican, and which fed this growing anger in me. And I think those same things were, infecting everyone else, and everyone responded in a different way. The burden was pretty heavy, in terms of the shame of not feeling that your parents were worth anything, because the teachers and the schools treated them like children.
There were clear signs of prejudice and discrimination.
I remember vividly when I was an honor student being asked by the white counselor what my father did for a living, and me telling her, well, he's a laborer, he works with his hands. And then she told me, and I'll never forget this, these were the exact words, that is a very honorable profession. You should follow in your father's footsteps.
My homemaking teacher, she would say, you little Mexicans, you better learn and pay attention. This class is very important because, most of you are going to be cooking and cleaning for other people.
It was real clear to me that there was a definite tracking system. Some students went into the academia tracking and were being prepared to go to college. Others were being tracked into going into the shop classes, into the vocational areas. It wasn't that there was anything wrong with that, but you didn't have a choice. You were tracked into those areas.
Students were grouped into the classes, generally based on some kind of ability rating. Usually it was IQ. The lower groups didn't get the same benefits and also didn't get the same support for going to college.
Gradually, these students realized they were not alone in their frustrations.
I heard that there were many more students who had the same kind of yearning and anger and desire to do something with their lives and not be stereotyped and pegged into being some sort of commodity for labor.
A lot of us had the same sort of complaints about what was happening in our lives as far as our education. So we decided to take a survey.
That's when we start to gather that information and start interacting with the school district saying, you're not meeting our needs. And look at, people are saying they don't get college advisements. Kids are saying that they get pushed out of school, that discipline is not fair. They went from better food all the way to, we want to go to college.
We have the lowest reading rate in East LA, in the East Side schools. We have graduates that graduate from high school, that graduate, that are in the 12th grade, that graduate and are out to face the world and can only read 8th and a 9th grade reading level. And we believe this is a crisis.
We were just being passed because of our age and nothing else. So they really didn't care if we learned how to read or we knew how to spell or anything else like that. It was just a matter of, okay, just go.
I think the bottom line is the lack of concern of the teachers towards the kids and whether the kids were really getting an education or not. The reality set in that teachers weren't really concerned for the kids.
Students called for bilingual instruction, Mexican-American history courses, an end to corporal punishment, and the hiring of more Mexican-American teachers and counselors. Their efforts transformed America's understanding of what was meant by civil rights. They presented their demands to the Los Angeles School Board.
They felt like we were not counseling them, but we're trying to have them go into industrial arts. Well, that wasn't true at all. We were trying our best to get as many to go into a four-year school as would.
What can we do when we do not have the actual authority to control what the whole of society is doing? If we could distribute everybody equally and have equal funds everywhere and have equal quality of teachers, there would be no problem.
They patted us on the back, and my recollection was that they literally just threw away the results of our survey. And that began to politicize us.
The students were facing a problem that had for years caused concern within their community. As early as the turn of the century, Mexican-American families called for educational reform. They protested the segregation of their children in so-called Mexican schools, where teachers severely punished Mexican-American students for speaking Spanish in the classroom.
Keep in mind that the Spanish language for many Mexicans is almost a characteristic of being Mexican. It's a defining characteristic, not an incidental characteristic.
Young children were taught that the culture of their community, of their parents, was really a hindrance to success. If a child learned these kinds of things, he began then to look upon his cultural background, upon his parents, upon his community in a negative way.
So you treat them and you teach them at the lowest common denominator of labor and how to use your hands. And you get them out into the fields and into jobs as quickly as possible. That was the Mexican experience in schools.
By 1946, parents in Santa Ana, California were fed up. They filed suit against local school officials and won. Mendez versus the Westminster School District declared the segregation of Mexican-American children to be unlawful. It set the stage for the landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision Brown versus Board of Education, which declared segregated schools unconstitutional throughout the United States. Despite this ruling, segregated schools remained, and even in integrated settings, Mexican-American students still suffered from neglect and unequal resources.
The end result of this is that the Mexican children were given an inferior education, which prepared them for menial kinds of positions and jobs as cheap laborers, the kinds of positions their parents filled.
Our greatest resource is the skill and the vision and the wisdom of our people. If your education falters or fails, everything else that we attempt as a nation will fail. If you succeed, America will succeed. Over half of all the Mexican-American children have less than 8 years of school. How long can we pay that price?
There's a vast ignorance about the Mexican, and consequently there's a myth that the Mexican is pliable, he is non-resistant, and that anybody can do anything to him that anybody wishes. Well, this isn't true. But now that he's become an urban Mexican, and now that there's a more numerous generation of...
Dr. Ernesto Galarza, a longtime labor activist and educator, sensed that traditional perceptions of the Mexican-American community were about to be challenged.
The tensions within the Mexican community are increasing, and they show themselves in the current protest movements.
Despite the earlier efforts to improve education, a half-century of frustration was about to explode in the East Los Angeles schools.
This was a time in which enough Chicano students had gained mastery of the tools that were necessary to shake up the system and had taken the ideals of the country to heart. And so we protested for our rights.
It was the political evolution of a group of young Chicanos in East LA. From being involved in community civic-minded activities as young citizens for community action, and then becoming culturally aware of their background, their history, their race, and becoming young Chicanos for community action, and asserting their real identity, and then getting involved and realizing that the system wouldn't change unless you became more direct action.
During that time, we were building support. We were all talking to other students at campuses, we were talking to teachers, people were talking to their parents, and we were building support in the community.
I was a first-year graduate student, and I was involved in the initial organizing of UMAS, which stands for the United Mexican American Students. And we had begun to talk with other leaders in the area at other campuses that we needed to commit ourselves as college students to the betterment of our community, and in particular to changing things for the betterment of our sisters and brothers in the high schools, for example, in the elementary schools.
Sal Castro, an outspoken history teacher, helped to organize the students.
For years, the schools have rapped or blamed the Mexican home for not doing a good job in educating the kid. In other words, if the kid doesn't go to school, it's a Mexican parent's fault or it's a Mexican home's fault. Well, I've yet to see a Mexican kid come into school at the age of 5 or 6 years of age, not knowing a language.
Castro grew up in East Los Angeles, where he learned firsthand the problems within these schools.
He has learning readiness, or he's ready to learn when he walks into school. So it's not the fault. It has never been the fault of the Mexican home.
His activism was shaped by vivid memories from his youth. In the 1930s, Sal's father was deported to Mexico, part of a U.S. repatriation program provoked by the Great Depression. In the 1940s, he witnessed the Zoot Suit riots, when U.S. soldiers and sailors attacked Mexican Americans in the streets of Los Angeles. By the spring of 1968, Sal Castro knew clearly what he was up against.
Most teachers approach the Mexican with a negative attitude, and you have nothing to give to me. I am going to make you an Anglo come hell or high water, and whatever you have to say about it makes no difference.
We had to now say the schools are not working. They're taking our taxpayers' money, the hard money that our fathers and mothers worked for, and not returning in any way. We're the only ones losing out.
A massive walkout to shut down the schools was what we somehow decided on. Change wasn't going to come from within, it had to come from without.
How many people were going to do it and who was going to do it was, I think, decided that morning for a lot of us, and me included.
And at 9 a.m., while we were all sitting in class, everyone was aware this was going to happen.
The signal was going to be blow out, blow out. And so we went around the school and said, hey, blow out, blow out. So then all of a sudden kids began to come out of those classes and the teachers didn't know what was going on.
My friends would go down the hallway saying, walk out, walk out. And I remember looking at them and thinking, my God, am I really going to do this?
And all of a sudden, the chanting began, Chicano power, Chicano power, ya basta, we demand change.
In the morning, as I walked into school, as the bell rang for the kids to go to school, into the classroom, out they went. Kids from all over, different hallways and everything else, bam, out in the streets, with their heads held high, with dignity, It was beautiful to be a Chicano that day.
4,000 students walked out of 5 East Side high schools that day. By the end of the week, 16 schools were affected, with more than 10,000 students out in the streets. Reaction in the community was mixed. Not everyone supported the blowouts.
The majority of the students at Garfield High School do not condone or accept the method which has been used.
For me, it was kind of a sad time. I felt embarrassed about the way people were acting, and it felt uncomfortable to watch people acting rudely, loudly, treating people with disrespect.
But you guys put them down. You guys throw them.
School officials blamed outsiders, singling out a group of young militants called the Brown Berets.
Some people seem to feel that it's the Brown Berets who are running this show and getting everybody out. Do you agree with that, or who's responsible for what's happening? Is it the Brown Berets, or?
It's the Garfield High School Strike Committee.
Who organized this?
We organized this, the Garfield High School Strike Committee.
How'd you get the idea?
We just saw that the school was bad.
The Brown Beret organization became involved as we were fearful that the police, were going to come down heavy on these kids, and we wanted to protect them as much as possible. So the Brown Berets represented the security.
The Brown Berets were a paramilitary group. They advocated direct action and were often confrontational. As such, they became a source of great concern for the police and the local press.
The Brown Berets are a group of young Chicano students in college, and we've finally gotten together and are aware that the Chicano, the Mexican American, and the black man is not benefiting from this great American society. Little by little...
The newspaper, the local East LA Tribune, started accusing the Brown Berets of being outside agitated troublemakers. We would tell everybody that, look at what they're writing about us. You know who we are. We live here. We grew up here, and we're still here.
If the Mexican-American students want to lead this protest, a protest which we, unfortunately, have not had the courage as adults to lead in the past, then we will back and support the Mexican-American students in their efforts.
The administrators are saying that we're disrupting the educational process. That's not so. The educational process of Mexican Americans for over 20 years in East Los Angeles and throughout the Southwest has been disrupted by its failure to communicate with the Mexican American. That is the disruption. When 57% of the students at Garfield drop out year after year, there has to be a problem. We're not operating in a vacuum. There's social injustice.
They needed to be jolted and shocked. And it's what happened. I think the establishment, the status quo, was surprised that all these little Mexican kids would be blowing out and walking out and protesting.
What could the community have done? Did they have a legitimate complaint? Absolutely. Did they bring that complaint to public attention in the only way they could have? Probably. But were they right on everything? No.
Striking students gathered at a local park and demanded a meeting with school board members.
I cannot compel the Board of Education to come. My feeling is that members of the Board of Education will be happy to come and talk with you.
May I respond to that? Now, what I said to you is that I realize your limitations, but I'm also saying that we, the students, are demanding that they come. We are only asking you to relay this information.
And I remember the area superintendent tried to talk to us, but he didn't have anything to say. What could he say to us? And so the students got up there and spoke, and there was this tremendous energy and fervor. There was an excitement that we actually pulled it off.
Despite opposition, walkout leaders from East Side schools forged a united front.
And we're supposed to have a meeting with the school board, and they fixed down on us. But what they're trying to do is split us up, and we don't want them to split us up, do we?
My decision to walk out was probably the lightest decision in terms of what I probably would have liked to have done at that point, with that kind of youth and energy and anger.
That's why we're not going to be here like separate schools. We're all united Chicanos, right?
The walkouts continued. Tensions increased.
Could we please have a quiet? Now listen, the assembly will stop until the police leave. We are having a peaceful demonstration. We do not need police officers at this place. The policemen, if they are here, should leave the area. I think that we can take care of things ourselves. That
Community leaders and school board members tried to calm the situation.
to the extent that you dramatize the problem, you help me. To the extent that you convince the public that you will demand at all costs, you handicap me. Consider that.
I was aware that there was frustration within the minority community. I was aware that there was great political opposition within the majority community. And so I knew that, in a sense, we were sitting on a tinderbox.
Now, I'm going to tell you once again, we're asking for immediate action. If not, I really hate to do this again, but we will just have to walk out once more.
I command you, in the name of the people of the state of California, to disperse immediately. 2 minutes.
Problems began to escalate. Police were called in to maintain order.
The police were not our friends back then. They were there to keep us down. And certainly the authorities of the time felt that we were just crazy, that the Mexicans were getting out of control.
Start moving from here. Quiero los chavales que se descuenten de aquí porque ahorita va a ir un pedo en la fregada. So everybody starts splitting, man. I mean it, man. They're going to stop picking them in the buses.
The unlawful order assembly included the stands inside the football field. Anyone on the stands will be arrested.
Following the Watts riot in 1965, law enforcement began to undergo what we called DART training, disaster and riot training, recognizing that we may be facing a period of unrest. I'd be less than truthful if I sat here and said that we always do everything perfectly and never overreact. There are occasions when individuals do overreact.
The only thing that happened was that one of the gates on that Wednesday afternoon, they couldn't get out the gate, and one of all things, the quarterback on the football team tried to break the lock, and the police arrested him. And I said, you can't, we need him now, just take it easy, he's the quarterback.
I felt 2 arms on each side of my body, grabbed me underneath my arms, pulled me away off from the main line of students. They assumed I was an outsider from the school.
People were just running in the streets, just clubbing people. I mean, the police were just clubbing the people in the streets and running after them. And some of them were just sitting on the lawns there.
At first, to see such resistance, and then to see outright hostility, brutality, it didn't match the thing that we were doing. We didn't commit a crime. We were protesting.
I thought they had overreacted somewhat, and that might have been because I don't think they had had such a thing before in their career of confronting 200 or 300 high school students determined to cross the street. That's what it amounted to.
I think what people saw was that even when kids were involved in constitutionally protected activity, such as legitimate protests, such as the walkouts, and yet they were abused and jailed.
Police were not kind to high school students. They treated them in the same way that they treated other Mexicans, and that was not very good. So the parents were concerned that somebody would get hurt.
We knew what the danger was. We could see it. But we also couldn't stop it. They were already there. They were doing it themselves. So it just spurred us on to get these reforms going so that it would cool off.
We gotta stay together and not have violence.
School authorities began to pressure the striking students.
The kids are now getting calls from principals that they're going to be suspended, that they're going to be expelled, that anybody that was headed for college and had grants or scholarships, the scholarships were to be taken away. We needed some public official to say the kids are right.
We all went to go meet Bobby Kennedy on the day he was about to go meet Cesar Chavez, who was undergoing his fast at the point, to request that he support our efforts, in which he did, in which he was very, I guess, generous with his words and very offered us positive support.
He knew all about the walkouts. He had had a list of our demands. He asked us a couple of questions, and he told us that he supported everything that we did.
We are not going to play games.
Parents concerned for their children's future became actively involved.
We are not going to allow this situation to continue. We are not going to let young people below the age of 18 do the work that belongs to us.
As their children had done, they asked to meet with school officials. Their request was denied.
It seems that our voices are not heard. What else have they left for us to do? All we can do is support them.
We spent 3 weeks trying to find one educator to understand the meaning of lack of respect. El respeto al derecho ajeno es la paz.
It's a real place where our movement was going to definitely demonstrate its full potential and strength was here in the city. For the first time, what was more significant is not what individuals were doing, but what masses of people were doing. And that's what the walkouts demonstrated. Our movement was not a movement of cadres, of individuals, of organizations, but of mass involvement.
Men and women of the Mexican-American community.
3 weeks later, the school board bowed to pressure and agreed to meet with parents.
We have allowed our young people to get the short end of the stick for too long.
The students returned to school, hoping things would work out. Parents and teachers from East LA began meeting regularly with the school board to implement the students' demands. The students had not only taught their parents about education, they'd also expanded the concept of what civil rights meant in America. By early June, things seemed back to normal.
"2:30 in the morning, banging at the door, bang, bang, bang. And I go to the door, bang, the door comes down. The LAPD, sheriffs, county sheriffs, with their weapons drawn, come right in, with their weapons pointed at my head.
He grabbed me, threw me into a car, pulled his gun, handcuffed me, and I asked, what am I being arrested for? And they wouldn't tell me. So the next thing I knew, I was downtown in the Glass House.
They put the cuffs on me, and they said, we're going to take him off. They took him off again, and we're going to give you 10 steps, then you can make a run for it. I knew what they wanted to do. And I said, ah, cabrón, I said to myself, this is really serious business, you know. And I was scared for my life. And all I can remember thinking was my children, you know, my 2 children, what's going to happen to them after they kill me? And I put my hands back again. You better cuff me and take me in.
13 Chicano leaders involved in the walkouts were arrested and indicted on conspiracy charges. One of them was Sal Castro. If convicted, each defendant faced 66 years in prison.
You know, in reality, it's not us that are indicted. It's not us that are up for conspiracy. Because in the long run, the indictment will be on the Board of Education. The convictions will be on the individual members of the Board of Education, principals, vice principals, and counselors who've been completely negligent of their jobs for years and years and years. And it's not only an indictment of the Los Angeles schools, but of all the schools in the Southwest, where Chicanos have gone to for years, and where the schools have failed miserably in teaching them. They will be indicted, and they will be convicted. And in the long run, our kids will win, the Mexican will win, the United States will win. All of us ganaremos. Gracias.
When we were told what we were arrested for, we were shocked. Because in particular, they created a felony indictment. Disrupting a public school was only a misdemeanor. But the conspiracy to commit a misdemeanor was a felony.
The East LA 13 was the first political trial of the Chicano movement. All of a sudden now, we had a real problem at hand, and we had some very, very good, dedicated people that were going to be given a terrible time in the courts and possibly a criminal record for trying to make the city and the state do its job better.
I think that the community recognized that that arrest was designed to stop this movement. And so we knew that we had to come to their defense. It was just another thing they were throwing at us that we had to surmount.
The reason for the interest of the American Civil Liberties Union in this case is that the indictment charges no more than acts of urging others, for instance, to engage in a boycott of the schools. And in our view, such urging is fully protected by the First Amendment, and the prosecution violates the Constitution.
The entire conduct of these proceedings has been political harassment. It's an outright political attack on the entire Mexican-American community, directly and indirectly on all of the rest of us, because our civil rights are involved too. The demonstration is a poor man's printing press, and his right to use it has got to be as inviolate as the rich man's right to print his newspaper, or else our talk about free speech is just a mockery.
Police harassment or harassment is not new to the Brown Berets. It seems that Chief Redden and the Los Angeles Police Department have mistook community sentiment.
The LA 13 were released on bail on Monday, June 3rd, 1968. But their release was overshadowed by the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy 2 days later. The Chicano movement was suddenly on the defensive against the police and even the FBI.
The day that we were at Lincoln High School for the first blowout, there were guys with suits on, with cameras, taking our pictures. It was part of, I learned later on, part of the FBI counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, that had been created to deal with the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. And documents that I got also showed the infiltration of UMAS and Chicano student organizations.
It changed the political landscape of the movement. And it changed my life because instead of pushing for social justice, we had to completely reverse into defending ourselves. So that the political struggle became a struggle to keep some of its own leadership out of jail. And I remember, just beginning to have this sense that I was being watched. And people started talking about it. We started talking about provocateurs and infiltrators. And certainly after these arrests, everyone was paranoid.
The Brown Berets were a special target.
The LAPD at that time was doing surveillance. They were taking a lot of photographs, and we didn't realize this till way later on when we were arrested. We felt it was an attempt to try to stop the movement, the growing movement. And little did we know that the Berets by then had already been infiltrated by the sheriffs and the LAPD.
One of the walkout leaders who said he was from Wilson High School turned out to be an LAPD.
Everyone was suspect. And with good reason. It turned out that a significant number of the people in these various organizations were police officers or informants. Many of them were actually the people who were proposing violent actions.
The officials were keeping tabs on certain individuals, which were then being referred to the FBI on subversive activities, in which I was one of those people who was listed as one of the 100 most subversive individuals in the United States in 1970.
What I started to see was a series of arrests and threats against me personally and other Berets. You guys are troublemakers, you're making our people look bad, and we're gonna be sure that you spend the rest of your life in prison or you end up dead.
And I began to get these documents as the years went on in doing my research, and sure enough, I got a bunch of documents on myself. And then I realized why it was that night that I was arrested, that early morning that I was arrested, why I was almost killed. Because in those documents, the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover himself, had identified me and the rest of us, conspirators and protesters, as subversives. Dangerous, armed subversives. And my God, all we were doing was nonviolent protest.
As schools opened in the fall, the East LA 13 felt the full impact of their indictments.
I walked in this morning and they told me I could not teach, that I would have to go downtown to personnel, that I could not teach.
Who told you?
The principal.
There was a ruling, part of the education code, that if you are arrested, you cannot be in the classroom. And then because I was indicted, I was an indicted felon, for sure I could not be out in the classroom. So I was going to have problems as far as teaching.
The struggle in the East Los Angeles school system came down to a single defining moment. Students and parents fought to get Sal Castro reinstated.
This was a person who put himself out on the line, and his community came to his support. And at that point, whether you liked him or you didn't like him wasn't even the issue. The issue is that this community, the Chicano community in Los Angeles, had to have a role in what the schools did.
What do you think it will take to get people to pay attention to the demands of the Mexican-American community?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, in looking in retrospect, there were about 15,000 kids out in the streets in that week of March. There were about 16 schools involved, not only senior highs throughout East Los Angeles, but also in West Los Angeles, in support of the kids in East LA. There were junior high schools involved. There were about 45 high school students arrested. There were about 25 adults. And, the majority community seemed like was unconcerned, business as usual.
We picketed that high school every day with a contingent of people picketing to call for Sal Castro be returned to Lincoln. And in between our daily pickets at Lincoln, we also went to the school board meetings, which were on Tuesdays and Thursday afternoons, to address them and ask them to return Sal to Lincoln.
It was Zapata who said
I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees. In front of Lincoln High last week, the crippled and the blind paraded so that you might have eyes to see and courage to stand on your feet and to deal in good faith with the Mexican-American community.
After 10 days of picketing without results, Chicano activists resorted to a new tactic. Instead of walking out, they sat in.
And we said, well, we're not going to leave. And we'll sit here and we'll stay here until you make the decision that our needs of the Chicano community in this city are taken care of. And the community has the right to make decisions about the kinds of people who teach in their schools.
It just seemed like the next logical step, you know, that we had to kind of apply a little bit more pressure. We were determined to occupy that room, and that was our main function. You know, we slept there. We kept that room occupied through that whole period.
I'd never done anything like that before. And it was civil disobedience. And civil disobedience means that you have to take the consequences. So we knew what the stakes were, but we knew we had to do it.
At one point, they turned off the air conditioning. At one point, they turned off the phones. At one point, they turned off the heat. And they did all these interesting things to make us uncomfortable. But there were things you read, a lot of books. We sang. We had mass. It was a time to talk about what we were going to do next. And every day, you know, we thought it was going to end every day. We thought, okay, it'll be over. They're going to listen.
Our people want the school system to respect the integrity, to have respect for the dignity of the person, regardless of his cultural background and regardless of his economic power. We live in a society that respects money. And we, in the Mexican community, are insisting that the schools learn to respect people.
I still have a very vivid memory of the people sitting on the floor as I walked to my office. I wish I could have had them come into my office or come into the board in executive session and see all of the problems. Then they would understand that we didn't want to do to them what they thought we were doing to them.
After 7 days, the board agreed to vote on Sal Castro's reinstatement. But they demanded that protesters end the sit-in or be arrested.
That last night, the officers came in and made the announcement that they were going to begin arrests. And those of us who didn't want to be arrested had to leave.
35 demonstrators refused to leave.
You are hereby notified that this building will be closed at 10 o'clock p.m. That any permission, implied or otherwise, to remain on these premises is hereby revoked. You will be considered trespassing and in violation of California Penal Code, Section 602N.
It was clear to us that we did not have the power and that they could crush us if they decided to, as certainly they had crushed many other movements.
The next day, as the board prepared to vote, Chicano leaders made a final appeal.
It's not so much, Mr. Castro. It's the issue, what the man means to every teacher. Academic freedom, shall we call it, to a Negro, to a Mexican, to an Anglo, shall we say.
We are here to express to you that in accepting a Mexican teacher who says that it's good to be Mexican, you're also accepting a principle that may govern our city without barbed wire in the middle of the street. For out of one flesh has God made all men.
The Los Angeles School Board began to vote as the community watched.
Roll call, please. Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Dr. Hardy?
Yes.
Dr. Nalla?
Yes.
Dr. Rich?
Yes.
Dr. Wood?
No.
Reverend Jones?
Yes.
I move we adjourn.
Cal, they called you a troublemaker, a rabble-rouser, and everything else. Are you that?
No, I don't think so. I'm a reformer in education.
What does that mean?
There are many changes that have to be made because at this point, education is not relevant to kids in general and Mexicans in particular.
Sal Castro and the other LA 13 defendants won their battle with the school district, but they still faced the possibility of long prison terms. Their legal battles would continue for 2 more years.
The East LA 13, which was, of course, the case coming out of the walkouts, was ultimately thrown out of court on appeal, again based on the Bill of Rights. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition the government for redress of grievances.
The walkouts were the first significant urban struggle of the Chicanos. And all that our kids were trying to do was to make the schools work better.
What the walkouts did, it focused the attention now on the Chicanos in the city, because these kids were serious. These kids that went to school from that time, they were going to do something. They were going to change the world.
Los Angeles was only the beginning. Soon after the blowouts, Chicano students across the country staged similar protests, igniting a movement for educational reform that would continue for many years to come.
We were very successful at informing the public about how serious the conditions were. Also in getting our parents and other community people involved.
The blowouts made us all realize that, wow, collectively we had a strong voice, and it gave us a power that we didn't realize that we had before. And we knew that we were going to win in one way or another.
In the 1960s, a new generation of Mexican Americans created a militant social movement in response to the anger and frustration that had been building for so many years within their community. In California and Texas, they demanded humane treatment in the fields where they labored. In New Mexico, they fought to reclaim land once owned by their ancestors. As the nation watched, Chicanos took on the most challenging quest of the Mexican-American civil rights movement.
Soy de Texas, es mi orgullo ser chicano. En los barrios me pueden encontrar.
In the 1960s, Mexican Americans made up the majority of the population of South Texas. Most were migrant farm workers, poor, with little education. After picking the winter crops, many of them travel across America in search of yet another harvest.
This part of the country has been built on the backs of the Mexican Americans. So you had every bit as much segregation, unequal education, and so forth as the African American did in the Deep South.
The few wealthy landowners were Anglo. The huge majority of the population was locked into a labor pool of just reserve labor. Owners of businesses were all Anglos. I don't recall in the downtown area a single Mexican-American business when I was growing up.
In Crystal City, where Jose Angel Gutierrez grew up in the 1940s and 50s, Mexican Americans accounted for 85% of the population, but they had no political representation. For years, Mexican Americans had been denied the right to vote by obstacles like poll taxes, literacy tests, and gerrymandered voting districts.
You take a county where we might be the majority of the population. Well, what the Anglo establishment had done was to divide the county in such a way that it was simply impossible for Mexican Americans to really gain political power.
We had the poll tax back then. Most people did not have the money, and if they did, they had the sense not to spend it on the privilege of voting, because it was always white candidates, and that was always the results.
The situation was people were, in many cases, denied the right to vote because they didn't speak English. In other cases, they were in sort of peonage to a boss or patron and were required to vote as he wanted them to. He would pay the poll taxes and they would vote for who he said to vote for. So it was really an archaic system.
We did work very hard. All 5 of us went house to house as
In 1963, for the first time in more than 100 years, Mexican Americans put up their own candidates for office and challenged Anglo politicians for control of city government.
We had to be ingenious and invented cakewalks and tamale sales and dances where you would pay supposedly for the cake or the tamales or the dance, but end up getting registered to vote.
Although only a student, Gutierrez was active in the campaign, making speeches, registering voters, organizing rallies. The 5 candidates known as Los Cinco surprised political observers by defeating the Anglo mayor and the All-Anglo City Council. The victors quickly learned that long-standing traditions do not change easily. First, Texas Ranger A.Y. Alley refused to turn over the keys to City Hall. A phone call from Texas Governor John Conley forced him to accept the new officials.
We decided we was going to try and put some...
The local business community was more effective in its strategy.
Didn't you lose your job just after the election results were announced?
Yes, sir, I sure did.
You cut your salary, yes.
In Sansing, I'm going on $35 a week. I don't know how long I could stand it, but I'm doing it right now.
They began trying to indict one of the members of the council for a check that had bounced. They tried to remove 1 or 2 others for being late in payments of utilities. And they ran a slate against us the next time around and beat us.
The rise and fall of Los Cinco echoed a long history of conflict between Mexican Americans and the South Texas power structure.
In the history of oppression of Mexicanos or Chicanos in the United States, Texas was probably the worst. You have more of a history of conflict. You have more of a history of land grabbing, outright land grabbing. You have more of a history of just outright physical oppression of the Mexican population in Texas. In fact, in the 20s, the New York Times had an editorial that's saying that the indiscriminate killing of Mexicans in Texas had reached the proportions of being a scandal.
The Texas Rangers were created in 1823 to protect settlers from outlaws. They had a reputation for intimidation and violence toward Mexican Americans.
I was coming up Military Road with Colonel Hickok, and they came to some big mesquite trees, and there was 4 Mexicans hanging by the neck. The colonel says, "Peavy, I guess the Rangers have been through here."
In the face of this frontier justice, terrorized Mexican Americans were reluctant to fight for their civil rights.
Down there, law enforcement was used for private purposes. They were acting as a private police force for some of those farmers down there, employers down in the valley. This is back in 69, 70, somewhere in there. And certainly for the years and years before that, no action was brought against the Rangers. They were just a law unto themselves.
Ranger Alley and the Anglo Council were back in power. It was business as usual in Crystal City.
I never forgot those kinds of dynamics that go on, and from then on became vigilant that it's not just important to take power. You've got to be able to hold power and govern effectively. So I learned by watching.
Jose Angel Gutierrez went on to graduate school at St. Mary's University in San Antonio. There he met Willie Velazquez. Before long, they were working together to bring change to Mexican-American politics.
We had a regular study circle. We'd read about King and we'd go look for him. We traveled Atlanta several times. We'd read about Stokely Carmichael and the SNCC activists, and we'd track them down. We learn about Corky Gonzalez and Reyes Tijerina, and we'd go find them. Or Chavez. I mean, we actually read and then went out and got informed firsthand.
Gutierrez wrote his thesis on the conditions for revolution in South Texas.
What he meant by revolution was fundamental change in electoral, economic, and social context. Remember, at this time in South Texas, Mexican Americans were legally barred in many ways from taking part in politics.
Early attempts to organize Mexican Americans began in the 19th century. Some successes came in 1929 with the formation of LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens.
LULAC was very much aware of the oppression which Mexican Americans were experiencing in South Texas. They're very successful in breaking down some discriminatory barriers in the area of education, in the area of employment, in the area of health services.
By the mid-40s, Mexican-American servicemen and women returned from World War II, only to find that discrimination was still part of everyday life. These conditions led to the creation of the American GI Forum.
What galvanized the organization was an incident where a returning war hero was refused burial in his own hometown by the Anglo mortuary funeral home.
Felix Longoria from Three Rivers, Texas, died a hero during the liberation of the Philippines.
The idea that a hero could not be buried in his own hometown angered people so much that it really symbolized a lot of the concern, the grievances that these Latino servicemen had.
The GI Forum sent a telegram to then-Senator Lyndon Johnson. He intervened, arranging for Longoria to be buried with honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Many Mexican Americans remembered Johnson's support at election time.
I ask your help in this campaign.
In 1960, John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign recognized the potential power of groups like LULAC and the GI Forum and solicited Mexican American voters.
John F. Kennedy, candidato demócrata a la presidencia, quiere combatir estos males. Es el único candidato que se preocupa.
Kennedy was an extremely popular political figure among Mexican Americans, primarily because he was Catholic, and primarily because he capitalized on that Catholicism by reaching out to the Mexican American population, which was something that prior presidential candidates did not do.
Political activists formed Viva Kennedy clubs throughout the Southwest. Kennedy won Texas by 20,000 votes.
I do not ask you to choose.
The state's Mexican Americans voted for him 10-1. Kennedy's election gave Mexican American political activists a newfound sense of power and raised their expectations. But they were soon disappointed.
Very small crumbs of the political pie were passed out to the Mexican-American communities. And so there was this disappointment, especially through the 60s, on the part of the Spanish-speaking youth with the democratic lack of fulfillment of promises and intentions.
Chicano activists, impatient for change, believed they had better strategies for getting political power than those of the previous generation.
There was a great dissatisfaction building within the community, especially among the youth, over the old line organizations like the GI Forum, like LULAC. who had by this point been reduced to social clubs that did a little. They would go out and they would never really protest anything because they didn't want to compromise their dignity.
By 1968, Gutierrez and other students from St. Mary's formed a more militant alternative.
If you can't be an activist, if you can't risk everything, don't bother to join us. Join the GI Forum, join LULAC, because we were looking for people that would go out, take on tactics that were in every way confrontational.
We were convinced that we were the generation that was going to recover the land in the Southwest, not by taking the land, but by taking political control of the institutions in the land.
Jose Angel Gutierrez began organizing the Mexican Americans in Crystal City, determined to win back the government that had been denied Los Cinco.
He was at the right place at the right time. We all needed change, but we weren't quite sure how to go about it.
Gutierrez targeted the schools where young people were fed up with negative stereotypes.
Every time in our history books they talked about Mexicanos, it was about the Mexicano bandido, you know, all the bad things the Mexicanos did. And we were seen as lazy. I still remember seeing in the history books the Mexicano with his sombrero over the top and being asleep. And that's what we had to deal with, the image that they had of us there. And that was projected onto us, and it was hard to overcome that image that they had.
And then, on the sidelines of high school football, this anger found a common cause.
In these small towns, the whole civic life revolves around high school football. The cheerleaders were always the most popular, the most beautiful, the most whatever to succeed, and so forth.
At Crystal City High School, Mexican Americans outnumbered Anglos 8-1. But school officials would only allow one Mexican American on the cheerleading squad. When Diana Palacios tested that policy, she was rejected by the teachers' committee.
That's when we all really sort of opened our eyes and looked around and realized that all these things had been going on, and we had just kind of sat back and let it happen.
Students threatened to walk out unless given Mexican-American cheerleaders, teachers, and counselors. They also demanded courses in Mexican-American history and something that had long been a sore point, the right to speak Spanish in school.
Which we presented to the school board and would not listen to our demands.
I had been caught speaking Spanish, and one of the rules was you do not speak Spanish, not in the halls, not in the recreation or anywhere. And one of the teachers sent me to the principal's office, and I got paddled.
With a boycott imminent, organizers hoped to get parents involved.
We went and asked the men to support us. And of course said no, because if they came, they would kill all these principals and teachers and whatnot. And they said, well, go see the vieja, take the wife. They'll do it. So we took the wife. And the wife was thrown out summarily from the school board. So then we went back to them and said, they threw your wife out, guy. You know, and they're saying your daughter's ugly. She can't be a cheerleader. They only want the pretty ones with the white legs. Now, there's no father who thinks he's got an ugly daughter. The school board insulted them too. So they had no way out. They said, you know, you kids are right. Mama, you're right. I mean, they don't listen to anybody. They won't even listen to us. So you do what you got to do. So the kids started chanting and screaming, walk out, walk out, walk out.
On December 9th, 1969, 700 students walked out of Crystal City High School.
The fact that the Mexican-American students walked out over a cheerleading position was very, very significant and took an enormous amount of courage at that time. It went directly to the whole hierarchy down there to try to change that around.
Representatives of the United States Department of Justice intervened to mediate the crisis.
An agreement has been reached between the school board, the parents, and the students. Some of the students have returned to school this afternoon, and it's my understanding that the rest of them will return in the morning.
The school board agreed to all of the demands. 3 months later, Diana Palacios was voted head cheerleader of Crystal City's varsity squad. Building on this success, Mexican Americans in Crystal City created their own political party, La Raza Unida, the United People.
We no longer accept the fact that we are powerless and need to be complaining about our powerlessness. We know we're powerful. We know we can be organized. We know we can triumph. We know that our destiny is not tied to hoes in the fields, but tied to much greater and loftier goals and levels, if we would only take the step in that direction. La Raza Unida is an example of this kind of step.
It was very clear in the minds of everybody there that a political party was important because, we had come to the conclusion that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party were one and the same. It was the same animal with two heads.
For the first time since the defeat of Los Cinco, large numbers of Mexican Americans registered to vote in Crystal City. This time, they registered for the Raza Unida party. The party found its greatest support among women.
95% of the people that were registering voters and getting people out to the polls were women. And yet we didn't have a say-so in the decision-making process. We actually had a walk-in to one of their meetings and said, hey, we don't want to be the tamale makers and the workers, and we don't want to be the busy bees. We really want to be part of the decision-making process. And at that time, half the men broke off of Raza Unida, and they said they didn't want to be part of it if the women were going to be involved. The group split because of that.
As the party launched its campaign, women proved to be strong organizers.
When women came into the party, they fell into this greater context of La Familia de la Raza. So when we organized or went out to recruit people, we went out to recruit wives, mothers, girlfriends, sisters, sisters-in-law. And because of the context of political familism, it was easy for us to recruit women.
By participating in the decision-making process, women of La Raza Unida set a precedent that changed the way men and women worked together in the movement. Raza Unida campaigned to take back control of the Crystal City government, working not only to win, but to win decisively.
The Raza Unida platform was bilingual education, regulation of public utilities, farm subsidies, an equitable tax structure, all of the issues that appeal to a working class population was essentially the backbone of the Raza Unida platform.
So on election day, in April 1970, out of 16 possible races that we could win, in the school board and the city council, we won 15. It was a total wipeout, just about.
The business community denounced Raza Unida. The local newspaper led the charge.
Raza Unida has brought nothing but hate, distrust, turmoil, and complete financial irresponsibility to our community. The only way to stop this disruptive and destructive force that is attempting to gain complete control over people's lives and livelihoods is to refuse to vote for candidates who are supported by La Raza Unida.
The Anglo population reacted with horror and recoiled from this prospect. They, after all, had been at the top of the heap, and all of a sudden the levers of political power were removed, and other people had them. And not only did they have them, but they were almost turning the tables in terms of, as the Anglos perceived it, they were now suffering discrimination.
There's about 30 or 35% of the Mexican American here in Zavala County that vote for the Raza, and the other 60 or 70% are not voting, afraid to vote.
Why are they afraid to vote?
They are afraid of harassment and intimidation.
But in fact, Crystal City leaders couldn't stop the Raza Unida party, which was gaining support throughout Texas. In 1972, Ramsey Muñiz, a former football star at Baylor University and an attorney, announced that he would run for governor under the Raza Unida banner.
The key to the city, but we just don't want the key. We want the key to the whole state.
Ramsey Muñiz was a very attractive candidate. He was very able, he was tireless. I mean, he went out and campaigned day and night. He is what people wanted to be like. He made you proud of being a Mexican American.
And he'll tell you, I went to fight for my country. Hell, if we're good enough to die for the country, we're good enough to get an education in this country.
At first, the Democratic Party of Texas was unconcerned.
I don't think that we took the party that seriously. We didn't think in terms of impact, in terms of numbers, that they were making the strides that they hoped to make, and that it was still important that we address the broad Mexican-American community of Texas to win elections, and that's what we did.
The Ramsey Muñiz campaign brought widespread attention to the Raza Unida party.
We need to have 67,000 registered voters in the state so that we can get on the ballot.
Chapters appeared in Nebraska, New Mexico, Michigan, and Arizona. Before long, the Raza Unida party was registering voters and fielding Mexican-American candidates in 16 states.
The Raza Unida party crystallized the sense of nationalism, or a culmination of nationalism, I could put it that way. And a lot of my compañeras and compañeros consequently began to say, you know what, we need to manifest our movement's mission and goals in art form. Talking about politics and talking about struggle and power, but we were talking about art form and poetry and talking about writing, and it was a very psychological, liberating force, what I call the decolonizing of our minds, to not only promote an identity of Chicanismo or who we were as an indigenous people, but more importantly, as creators.
In Colorado, Corky Gonzalez saw his dream of a third political party for Chicanos envisioned at the Denver Youth Conference becoming a reality. He lost no time organizing a Denver chapter.
Would you like to register in La Raza Unida?
How do you spell that?
But in Los Angeles, Raza Unida produced division in the Mexican-American community.
So that we can get on the ballot. If you've been a Democrat for 50 years, and you've seen the conditions remaining the same for 50 years and nothing ever changes.
The idea of leaving the Democratic Party for this new organization was too radical for many Mexican-American voters. But Chicano activists saw it differently.
We can start working to elect our own things, elect our own candidates. It takes you about a minute to register.
The positives were that for the first time we had our own party. On the negative side, however, was what happened with Raul Ruiz and Richard Latorre electoral campaign in Los Angeles, which was pitting Mexican against Mexican.
We're tired of everybody saying it's not our jurisdiction.
Assemblyman Richard Alatorre was the incumbent.
And the reason that we ran in this race was primarily to challenge the Democratic Party.
Raul Ruiz, a young college professor, was the challenger.
All poor urban people are going to vote Democrat. And
Raul Ruiz was a Raza Unida candidate. And the party, the Democratic Party, had not historically been responsive to our needs. So we knew the need. I mean, we saw the logic and the virtue in taking on another Chicano Democrat.
The idea of a third party was particularly offensive to those of us who had been working for change within the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. Young people were much more open to the idea of a third party, of an ethnic party, than some of us who had been around, and sort of the GI Forum, LULAC folks.
Ruiz lost, but his Raza Unida campaign took a substantial number of votes from the Democratic Party. For the first time in decades, a Democrat had lost to a Republican in the 48th Assembly District of Los Angeles.
Do you feel that the Mexican American is going to desert the Democratic Party this time around?
Not at all. I don't think so. Why should they? Democratic Party is the only party that's ever done anything for the Mexican Americans. You might know that.
Vital government services controlled and provided by what is
Many Mexican Americans argued that the Democratic Party hadn't done enough.
On the City Council of Los Angeles, made up of 15 members, not a single Chicano. Of the 5 members of the County Board of Supervisors, there has never in its 100-year history been a member from a minority community. The state legislature numbers 120, yet you will find only 2 Mexican Americans, both in the lower house. We have no U.S. senator in Congress, and only a single congressman sits in the House of Representatives.
Established Mexican-American politicians were part of the problem in the eyes of young Chicanos.
So many of us who were just barely getting our feet wet in terms of our political baptism at this time were becoming very angry and disillusioned at everything that represented the institution, not to trust anybody who represented the system, and that we felt that they had not done enough and that they had, in fact, sold out.
Back in Texas, Jose Angel Gutierrez and the Raza Unida grew increasingly militant.
We recognize that the barriers to our integrating into the society and to uplifting ourselves is the gringo who puts the barriers, who makes us, drop out of school, who keeps us in bad health, who doesn't pay us good wages, who prohibits our unions, and so on and so on and so on. So until we get rid of those elements, we're not going to progress, we're not going to be free. So yes, the gringo must go.
An Anglo group called the Citizens Committee denounced Gutierrez.
He has advocated publicly the killing of gringos. Does this mean only a certain age group of gringos? Or does it extend to the children, too? At what age does one draw the line? Where does the insurrection begin?
Henry B. Gonzalez, the first Mexican-American from Texas elected to Congress, also had something to say.
As having a responsibility to smoke out and to expose these false and mistaken voices of hatred. I feel that I fought against those in the majority who were preaching the same hatred 12 years ago in a different context, that I have the same responsibility to expose it among the minority, even if it is the minority from which I emerge.
That became the central part of my life, to be a militant, to be an activist, to be radical in the design of solutions. Because if you're anything less than radical, if you're just simply moderate, you're part of the problem. And certainly if you're not engaged and involved, then you are the problem.
Gutierrez's friend Willie Velasquez from St. Mary's days left Raza Unida to pursue the more moderate strategy of voter registration within existing parties.
We as people trying to get people elected.
He was opposed to the notion of the creation of a third political party that was specifically set up for Mexican Americans. So for him it was a very tactical kind of choice of saying that's not going to work, and that's why we can't go towards a third political party.
It wasn't that he was trying to be apart from the Raza Unida. He just didn't believe in an ethnic party. So it violated our sense of integration, a sense of trying to build a pluralistic, multi-ethnic, multi-racial society that to try to set up barriers was not what we're about. What we're trying to do is to knock these barriers down.
The very existence of the Raza Unida party raised a fundamental question. Is it better to work within the existing political system or to be totally independent of it.
The very people that are in those buildings, they're all on welfare.
Corky Gonzalez believed that to have a real voice in politics, Mexican Americans needed their own party.
My feelings were of having a party that would serve its people, not a party that is serving a governor or serving some senator or serving the president of the United States, to serve their people.
We've had civil rights legislation for many years now, but we have also had so many amendments to it that they're not worth the paper written on.
Corky Gonzalez was adamant that there was nothing to be gained from supporting Democrats or Republicans. Despite his past rhetoric, José Ángel Gutiérrez saw value in the possibility of forcing concessions from the Democrats and Republicans. He believed Raza Unida votes could be used to gain leverage within the two major parties.
People who run for office need to be asked, what you going to do for me and what have you done lately, as a prerequisite before giving my vote. Richard Nixon and George McGovern were no different. We asked them those questions then.
It isn't going to be a good country for any of us to live in.
We didn't want to be attached to Republicans or Democrats. They were both wrong. They had both created damage against us. La Raza Unida stood for our independence, not for some phony politician to make deals. We could have made our own deals.
A dramatic confrontation between Gutierrez and Gonzalez was fast approaching. 1972, a presidential election year. Members of Raza Unida met in El Paso, Texas, to hold their party's first national convention.
For me, the eye-opening experience was that there were Chicanos all over the country. I mean, places that we typically didn't think in those days you would find Chicanos. And I think for the most part, we were just excited about the fact that we actually had a convention that we were going to. This was a real political party. And for a lot of us, it was educational in the sense that most of us had no clue about how, a political convention works. We knew the word delegates, but we didn't necessarily know what that meant in terms of a convention.
It was a wonderful experience. I mean, here we are with our movement, with our own party, and we're making history. Unfortunately, we had not reached all of our people. I mean, even our own families, we had a lot of confusion about why Chicano, for example. Why call yourself Chicano, You're Mexicano, right? And we had to explain to our own families why we were Chicano. And we were Chicano because we were proud to be Mexicans. We were proud of our cultural heritage. We were proud of our indigenous roots. That's what Chicano meant to us. It was a very exciting moment in my life, and it was a very scary moment too in many ways, because by that time we knew that there were dangers out there. We knew that the party was a definite threat as perceived by those in power.
A brief announcement, there is a press conference going on, I understand.
We know that the party was under surveillance by the CIA and the FBI. They feared a separatist movement. Analogies were drawn between the Raza Unida party and the separatist movement that was going on in Canada at the time. People feared that we would somehow form an alliance with Mexico, and that Mexico would somehow then come and claim its land back from the United States, and that Raza Unida would be the instrument by which that claim would be made. People simply feared the rise of radicals to power.
We'd been called everything communist, and people believed it. Even your own families, in some cases, thought that you were some kind of lunatic, some kind of radical. And then there was the personal things like people who threatened both in the mail and in the phone at all hours of the day and night, who'd call and, basically say they were going to get rid of you somehow.
Issues that the Chicano community is willing to mobilize around, the kind of issues that we can...
On the convention floor, delegates debated the age-old dilemma of the Mexican-American community: to work within the traditional two-party system or to go its separate way.
To me, La Raza Unida was a dream of an independent party, of people that believed alike, who were not represented by either Republicans or Democrats, and that we would make our own decisions about our own needs.
All in favor, raise your hand.
Even as Raza Unida activists were debating the two-party system, a group of Chicano legal activists won a landmark court case that would have a profound impact in the years to come. MALDEF, the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund, was formed to address, through the legal system, civil rights issues affecting Mexican Americans. In 1972, they challenged the at-large voting policy in Bexar County, Texas, that had traditionally prevented Mexican Americans from becoming elected to state office. White versus Register set a legal precedent. In subsequent years, many city, county, and state governments opted to change voluntarily rather than risk losing a court battle with MALDEF. At the Raza Unida convention, delegates debated issues that would make up the national party platform.
Do you want to take a vote against the NRA and for gun control?
We say that we want gun control. That means que estamos controlando.
The Texas delegation goes on record as supporting immediate withdrawal, total involvement in Vietnam.
Okay, land. Honor original Mexican and Spanish land grants. Cease taxation of the land.
I'm against that because all you're doing is giving it to a rich few, Spaniards.
We could go out and tell the truth. We could go out and campaign with real issues and take real positions that the other two parties would never dare take. We had no special interest supporting us. We had no self-interest that we had to guard, So we wound up taking some very, very incredibly progressive positions.
The objective here is to remove the Anglo police departments out of places where, like Los Angeles and East LA, where the sheriff and the LAPD are strictly Anglo-oriented, which makes no sense at all. You have, 500,000 people with the Anglos running them.
Delegates voted on whether Raza Unida should back one of the presidential candidates.
All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no.
The national position of the Partido de la Raza Unida from the First National Convention: support none of the two major candidates for President of the United States.
The vote emphatically demonstrated the delegates' preference for their own political party and endorsed Corky Gonzalez's separatist position. The convention now faced the job of electing a party leader.
I don't think we should limit ourselves to anything. And certainly we should not, immediately pull back our heads under the shell like turtles when there's a little bit of reaction from whites or concern about whites or even some, rock throwing within our own people, Maybe our own people are kind of...
It was clear that Corky was making a big move to be the only person elected at the convention. And I decided then to run against him. So then I turned to a fellow from California, Raul Ruiz, to take charge of the convention so that I could have time to organize against Corky.
Missouri.
You have two men, both who are very capable, both who are good organizers, both men who are very proud, and both of whom were completely confident in their positions, that they were right.
And we cannot afford the luxury of petty bickering and fights on minute rhetorical points in this convention. We must display
the fact that he had opposition and that Corky also wanted to be the chair is good. I mean, it's just like any other political party. It's better to have more than one person interested because you mobilize more people.
We were assuming that we're fighting against a stacked deck. So whether we won or not, we were going to give it as good a fight as we could.
Earlier, when we had made this decision that the method of voting of the individual states, and we had made this decision earlier, would be left up to the states. We did not say at this time that we would now go counter to that decision.
The debate centered around whether to vote by delegation or to vote individually. Gonzales supporters were convinced that he could win if states voted in blocks. Gutierrez would have the advantage if votes were cast individually.
How could we in our conference not count everybody's vote, regardless of whether it was against your interests or support somebody else? So basically, as chair, I allowed the motion to go through that would give the vote to everybody to cast their votes.
You are influencing the rest of the states. That's right. And you are out of order.
I would like to ask that both of these nominees come to the platform.
The California vote was split, and as I recall, there was even a half a vote someplace, and God knows how we got to half a vote. But anyway, we did.
California cast 17.5 votes for Jose Angel Gutierrez, 48.5 votes for Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez.
Votando 64 votos a favor de José Ángel Gutiérrez con un abstention.
256 and 1/6 vote for José Ángel Gutiérrez. José Ángel Gutiérrez is your new chairman.
We changed the nature of politics, certainly from the perspective of Mexican Americans. It's never going to be the same again. The fact that we said it was okay to take power and to control your own destiny were pretty radical thoughts then. Now it's pretty much accepted, which means we won on that one.
Our people are awakening, and their eyes are opening.
2 months later, Ramsey Muñiz lost the governor's race in Texas to Democrat Dolph Briscoe. But by receiving more than 200,000 votes, Muñiz denied the Democratic Party a majority for the first time in the 20th century.
When the Mason, do you think you're going to win? Les digo, I've already won. Look at this right here.
He got about 250,000 votes in 1972 against Briscoe and almost caused Briscoe's defeat. They counted that race till very late at night. By golly, that was close that night, and he almost pulled off what I think was the plan, and that is, if we can't win, we're not going to let the conservative Democrat win.
6 months after the convention in El Paso, an FBI memo called for tighter surveillance of Corky Gonzalez's crusade for justice. Denver authorities believed that crusade members were armed and dangerous. On March 17, 1973, over 230 Denver police officers surrounded the Crusade for Justice headquarters. Within minutes, a confrontation erupted, lasting for over an hour and a half. Police killed a 20-year-old crusade member.
My best friend was killed. Over 60-some people were arrested. I was shot in the back. 4 police officers were shot. Numerous people were hurt.
Later that evening, a Crusade for Justice building was bombed. Fearing for their safety, crusade members began leaving the organization. The Crusade for Justice would never fully recover. In Texas, Raza Unida continued to field candidates with little success. By 1974, the South Texas town of Crystal City was the last stronghold of the Raza Unida party. Despite its short life, the Raza Unida party succeeded beyond most expectations. It brought inspiration to a generation of political activists who went on to organize within the Democratic and Republican parties.
It introduced to the American public a brand new generation of leadership. I think it destroyed forever the stereotype of an apathetic, passive people that were afraid to speak out.
Among those influenced by Raza Unida was Willie Velasquez. In 1974, he created the Southwest Voter Registration and Education Project, which encouraged many Mexican Americans to register to vote. In the years that followed, Velasquez worked with the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund to challenge voting laws and policies that kept Mexican Americans from political power.
It is an interesting period because it is a time when people of Hispanic descent are beginning to mobilize their strength and are beginning to have impact in the American political process.
During the next 2 decades, more than 2 million new Latino voters were registered. Within 20 years, there would be almost 5,000 Latino elected officials in the United States. Half would come from Texas. The victories of the Chicano movement became the lasting legacy of decades of Mexican-American activism. The United Farm Workers made Americans aware of the plight of workers who brought food to their table and inspired labor activists in the cities.
I think that the farm workers movement was one of those life-changing instruments that helped teach so many of us the power that lies within each one of ourselves.
The walkouts challenged educators to respond to community needs and served as a catalyst for bilingual instruction in grade schools and the creation of Chicano studies programs at colleges and universities.
Students said, "Ya basta. We can think, we can learn, we can speak more than one language. We can read, we can write, we can go on to college, we can be professionals. We can contribute not only to this society but to our communities in ways that teachers have told us we can't do in the past."
A generation of Mexican-American artists, writers, poets, and musicians reclaimed their heritage and gave new definition to American culture.
I think that Chicano art had a very, very important role within the Chicano movement because it not only said what was going on, but it also questioned things. And that's what made it as rich as it is now.
We were young, demanding our civil rights, demanding our place in society, demanding access to education, demanding all of the things that we were entitled to as citizens of the United States, as human beings.
Chicanos, with a passion for social justice, helped bring about changes that expanded and inspired the meaning of civil rights in America.